Hey, welcome back to Dark Horror Bedtime. Get comfortable, dim the lights, and let your mind relax. Tonight's story is darker than usual, so listen closely. Just don't listen too closely to anything you hear behind you. Park rangers admit something is wrong in these parks. Park rangers are trained to project calm authority no matter what unfolds around them during long, unpredictable shifts. Visitors see uniforms, trail maps, and friendly warnings, but rarely understand what happens after radios go quiet and daylight fades behind trees. Most emergencies rangers respond to follow familiar patterns shaped by weather mistakes, exhaustion, or poor preparation. Falls, dehydration, wildlife encounters, and navigation errors explain the majority of incidents and usually leave evidence that behaves logically. Then there are the cases that do not behave correctly. Veteran rangers quietly admit that some incidents feel different from the moment the call comes in. The terrain looks manageable, the weather seems stable, and response times are fast, yet something refuses to align the way training says it should. These cases almost always begin calmly. A hiker fails to return by evening. A child wanders slightly ahead on a wide trail. A hunter misses a scheduled check-in. Rangers mobilize, expecting a routine search that ends with relief. In the first hours, nothing appears wrong. Trails are clear and well marked, dogs lock onto scent quickly, helicopters prepare flight paths. Everyone assumes the missing person will be found tired, cold, or injured, but alive. Then, the first inconsistency appears. Sometimes it is an object placed where it should not be. A boot standing upright in an open meadow, a jacket folded neatly on a rock, a backpack positioned beside a trail with no sign of struggle or panic. Rangers know the difference between accidental loss and deliberate placement. These scenes feel paused rather than chaotic, as if movement stopped mid-decision instead of ending suddenly. Tracking dogs provide another warning sign. In typical searches, scent fades gradually or breaks near water cliffs or heavy rock. In these cases, dogs stop abruptly in open terrain and refuse to continue. Handlers describe confusion rather than fatigue. The dogs circle, sit down, or pull back toward their handlers. The scent does not weaken. It simply ends without explanation. Rangers record these moments clinically without commentary. Protocol requires facts, not interpretation. Search grids expand, and teams continue working methodically. Privately, rangers take note. Distance becomes another problem. Children are located miles away across terrain that should have slowed them dramatically. Elderly hikers appear at elevations requiring physical effort far beyond their capability. Time and movement stop aligning logically. Some missing people are later found in areas that were already searched repeatedly. Rangers log this as delayed discovery, but the memory lingers. They remember standing in those same spots hours or days earlier, convinced nothing was there. Another pattern involves sound. During certain searches, radios lose signal only in specific drainages. Voices echo in directions that make no sense. Shouts disappear entirely in places where sound should carry. Official explanations blame terrain interference and atmospheric conditions. These explanations are technically accurate. What unsettles rangers is how often these failures coincide with disappearances. Weather also behaves strangely. Forecasts predict calm conditions, then sudden storms isolate individuals, while nearby groups remain unaffected. Snow or fog appears quickly and vanishes just as fast, leaving little evidence behind. Rangers do not write down how often this happens. They are trained to reduce panic, not invite it. Public fear complicates rescues and puts more people at risk. Some recovered individuals add another layer of discomfort. Survivors found days later sometimes appear calmer than expected. They struggle to explain where they have been. They describe hiding from weather that never occurred or following sounds that led them away from trails. Medical explanations exist for these behaviors: hypothermia, dehydration, head injury, stress responses. Rangers accept these explanations publicly. Privately, they notice repetition. The same types of terrain appear again and again. Boulder fields, talus slopes, dense berry patches, creek junctions, sudden elevation changes, places where visibility collapses and sound behaves unpredictably. None of these locations are inherently dangerous. Thousands of people pass through them safely every year. What troubles rangers is how consistently unexplained cases cluster near them across different parks and decades. Rangers also notice changes in themselves during these searches. Subtle disorientation that does not match fatigue. A feeling of being watched that fades when they leave certain areas. Time that seems compressed during grid work. None of this belongs in reports. A ranger who documents feelings instead of facts does not remain a ranger for long. So the silence becomes routine. Rangers speak carefully. They choose language that reassures families while avoiding speculation. They emphasize effort, dedication, and procedure. Behind that, professionalism sits unease. Because after enough years, some rangers realize these cases are not rare anomalies. They are infrequent but consistent. They follow patterns without explanations that fully satisfy experience or logic. That realization does not arrive suddenly. It builds slowly through repeated exposure to scenes that feel unfinished, evidence that behaves incorrectly, searches that end without closure. This is where experienced rangers begin to admit quietly that something is wrong in certain parks. Not in a dramatic, supernatural sense, but in a practical, unsettling one. Something about how people disappear does not always match how the land should behave. And once that thought settles in, it never fully leaves. This is only the beginning. As years pass, rangers learn which questions they are allowed to ask out loud and which ones must stay internal. Officially, every disappearance has a category and an explanation. Exposure, accident, medical event, navigation error, wildlife interaction. These labels keep reports clean and systems functional. Unofficially, rangers begin to notice patterns that those labels do not fully cover. One of the first things they notice is where these cases happen. Certain environments appear repeatedly across different parks and different decades. Boulder fields where sound behaves strangely. Talus slopes that shift underfoot without warning. Dense berry patches that swallow visibility in seconds. Creek systems that disappear underground and re-emerge far away. None of these places are rare. None are secret. What unsettles rangers is how often missing cases cluster around them, even when conditions seem safe. Another pattern involves timing. Many disappearances occur during transitions, late afternoon turning to evening, clear weather giving way to sudden fog, calm mornings followed by unexpected storms. Rangers describe it as the moment when the park changes personality. In some cases, people vanish while in groups. They lag behind briefly or move slightly ahead. Witnesses later say the separation lasted only seconds. Rangers know how fast distance can open in wilderness, but they also know when the math does not work. Searches begin quickly, sometimes within minutes. Dogs track confidently until they do not. Scent trails end in open terrain without water or rock to explain it. Handlers report that dogs act confused rather than exhausted, as if the trail simply stopped making sense. Rangers expand grids, check drainages, climb ridges, and revisit areas already cleared. Helicopters fly tight patterns overhead. Still, nothing appears. Then sometimes, evidence returns. A body is found in a place already searched multiple times. Clothing appears after storms that should have buried it deeper. Footprints reemerge where snow should have erased everything. Rangers write delayed discovery in reports and move on. Internally, they remember standing there before. Rangers also notice something harder to quantify. During certain searches, technology behaves unpredictably. Radios fail only in narrow zones. GPS devices drift or lose accuracy. Batteries drain faster than expected. These issues resolve the moment teams move out of specific areas. Terrain interference explains some of it. Rangers accept that explanation. What unsettles them is repetition. Sound becomes unreliable as well. Voices echo from wrong directions. Shouts vanish entirely. Searchers report hearing movement that never produces animals or people. When they stop, the sound stops. When they move, it resumes at the same distance. None of this goes into reports. Rangers are trained to be careful with language. Speculation invites panic. Panic puts more people in danger. So they focus on procedure and facts, even when the facts feel incomplete. Some of the most difficult cases involve recoveries. Children found alive days later sometimes appear physically better than expected. They cannot explain where they were. They repeat phrases that do not match time passed or distance traveled. They describe hiding from weather that never occurred or following sounds they cannot describe clearly. Doctors explain these responses as stress-induced memory disruption. Rangers accept that explanation publicly. Privately, they notice how often these children are found uphill, beyond logical travel routes, in places already searched. Another detail rangers rarely discuss is their own perception. During certain searches, experienced rangers report subtle disorientation that does not match fatigue or terrain, a sense that time is compressed, that hours pass without memory of specific actions. Some describe feeling watched, not in a threatening way, but in a way that suggests awareness. These feelings vanish when they leave certain zones. No ranger writes this down. A ranger who documents feelings instead of facts does not last long in the job. As a result, these cases accumulate quietly, each one filed, each one explained, each one leaving behind a residue of doubt for the people involved. Veteran rangers begin to recognize these incidents not as isolated failures, but as part of a category that lacks a name. Not supernatural, not accidental in the usual sense. Simply unresolved in ways that repeat too consistently. This is when some rangers begin to admit to each other, carefully and privately, that something feels wrong. Not wrong enough to close parks, not wrong enough to issue warnings, but wrong enough that they change how they move through certain areas, how they listen, how quickly they respond to instincts they once ignored. They do not tell visitors this. They continue smiling, giving directions, and offering safety tips. But internally, many of them understand that the land does not always behave the way training says it should. And that realization makes the silence heavier. When rangers finally admit that something feels wrong, it is rarely dramatic and never official. It happens quietly, after years of repetition, when explanations begin to sound thin even to the people trained to deliver them. By this stage in their careers, most of these rangers have seen everything they expected to see. Fatal falls, exposure deaths, medical emergencies, wildlife encounters. Those cases are tragic, but they make sense. Cause and effect remain intact. The cases that stay with them are different. They are the ones where effort does not equal outcome, where teams do everything correctly and still come away empty-handed, where evidence behaves inconsistently, appearing and disappearing in ways that defy normal environmental logic. Rangers do not say the parks are dangerous in a supernatural sense. They say something simpler and more unsettling. They say the wilderness is not fully understood, and that human systems fail under certain combinations of terrain, weather, and perception. They explain that maps give confidence, not certainty, that experience can create blind spots, that familiarity sometimes makes people slower to recognize when conditions are changing in subtle but critical ways. Over time, rangers adjust their behavior. They linger longer in certain areas, they revisit locations that do not make sense, they listen more carefully when something feels off, even if they cannot articulate why. They also become more careful about what they promise families. When relatives ask how someone could disappear so completely, rangers choose words that comfort without lying. They talk about vastness, about how quickly landscapes change, about how evidence can be missed even by trained teams. What they do not say is that sometimes, even standing in the right place at the right time, the land does not reveal what it has taken. After retirement, a few rangers speak more openly. Not in press conferences, but in long interviews, podcasts, or quiet conversations with researchers. They avoid sensational language, they avoid theories that would turn grief into entertainment. Instead, they focus on limits. Limits of search technology, limits of scent tracking, limits of visibility and sound, limits of how humans perceive space and time when surrounded by unfamiliar terrain. They admit that there are blind spots where people can vanish faster than logic allows, places where a few steps in the wrong direction are enough to break every assumption about safety. They also admit that no agency has a complete explanation for why these blind spots appear more frequently in certain parks and not others. That uncertainty is what makes them uneasy, not fear, respect. Rangers love the land they protect. They stay because of it. They understand its beauty and its danger better than most. Admitting something is wrong is not a rejection of the wilderness, but an acknowledgement of humility. The parks are not malicious, they are indifferent. They operate on scales of time, weather, and geology that do not align with human expectations. Sometimes those scales intersect with people in ways that leave no clean narrative behind. Rangers continue their work anyway. They train harder, they update protocols, they push for better communication systems and faster response times. They do everything within their power to reduce risk. Still, when a disappearance follows the old familiar pattern, the same quiet realization returns. Some cases cannot be explained fully with what we know now, and pretending otherwise does not make people safer. Park rangers admit something is wrong in these parks not because they want to scare visitors, but because they have learned that confidence without awareness is more dangerous than caution. Their unspoken message is simple. Pay attention, stay together, respect closures, trust instincts when the environment feels wrong, even if you cannot explain why. Because sometimes, despite preparation and experience, the land keeps its answers. And the most honest thing a ranger can admit is that not every disappearance has a reason we are ready to understand yet. In this new story, this dispatch log was quietly updated later. Official records from 1997 describe a very strange incident involving a digital emergency log that was changed several times. This specific case reminds investigators that the most permanent documents are sometimes the ones that people try to rewrite slowly. Elias Thorne was a 38-year-old data auditor who worked for the county sheriff in the Colorado mountains. He spent his days in a basement office surrounded by towers of old paper files and loud humming computer servers. His goal for the summer was to transition all of the historical police records into a new and secure database. Elias was a man who appreciated the clarity of numbers and the unchangeable nature of a well-written police report. On a rainy morning in 1997, he found a digital entry that did not match the paper backup file. The record was from the previous year in 1996, and it concerned a welfare check at the Blackwood mine. Dispatch logs from that night showed a call from a woman named Clara Vance, who lived near the forest edge. Clara had reportedly seen a series of pulsing blue lights coming from the abandoned tunnels behind her small wooden cabin. The original entry stated that Deputy Silas Miller was dispatched to investigate the source of the lights at 11 midnight. Elias noticed that the digital status of the call was changed to resolved without incident 4 months after it happened. However, the paper log contained a handwritten note that mentioned a strange humming sound and a sudden loss of radio. Elias felt a sense of unease as he realized the digital update was performed by the officer Silas Miller himself. The auditor decided to visit the evidence locker to find the original magnetic audio tapes from that cold night in October. He found the reels tucked away in a dusty corner where the sunlight never reached the gray and rusted metal shelves. The recording began with Deputy Miller checking in at the mine entrance and describing a thick and heavy white mist. Silas sounded calm at first, but his voice became strained as he approached the mouth of the deep and dark tunnel. He mentioned that his flashlight was flickering and the air inside the mine felt much warmer than the mountain night. Suddenly, the audio cut out for exactly 10 minutes, and then a different voice was heard on the official tape. The voice used the call sign of Deputy Miller, but the cadence and the tone of the speech were wrong. Elias listened as the voice on the tape claimed that the lights were only reflections from a passing weather balloon. The dispatcher accepted the explanation and closed the call, while Elias sat in the silent basement feeling a cold dread. He checked the personnel files and saw that Silas Miller had taken a 2-week leave of absence after that. When Miller returned to work, his coworkers noted that he had become very quiet and avoided all of his friends. He stopped attending the local Sunday services, and he no longer ate lunch at the diner with the other deputies. Elias looked at the digital log again and saw that another update had occurred just 3 days ago at midnight. The new update deleted the mention of the pulsing blue lights and replaced it with a report of a fire. The technician drove his white sedan out to the Blackwood mine to see the site of the original police investigation. The road was narrow and covered in loose gravel that crunched under the heavy tires of his small and slow car. He found the entrance to the mine and noticed that a new and heavy steel gate had been recently installed. There were no signs of a fire or any damage to the surrounding trees or the dry and yellow grass. Elias found a spent shell casing lying near the gate, and it was a type used only by the sheriff. He realized that Silas Miller had been returning to this remote location many times over the course of the year. The auditor took a photo of the casing and prepared to head back to the office to report his findings. As he turned his car around, he saw a patrol vehicle parked in the middle of the road, blocking his path. Deputy Silas Miller stepped out of the vehicle, and he was not wearing his standard uniform or his silver badge. He was dressed in dark clothes, and his face was pale and thin, as if he had not slept recently. Silas asked Elias why he was so interested in an old dispatch log that had been closed for a year. Elias tried to explain his job, but he noticed that Miller was holding a handheld radio that was glowing blue. The deputy smiled and said that the logs were being updated to protect the town from the things in mine. He claimed that the truth was too heavy for a digital database and it needed to be erased slowly over. Elias managed to drive past the patrol car by swerving onto the grass and accelerating quickly toward the main paved highway. He returned to the station and immediately locked himself in the basement office to finish the report on the log. He found that his access to the server had been revoked and the file for 1996 was gone. The paper backup that he had left on his desk was also missing, and the office felt cold and empty. He heard the sound of heavy boots walking down the stairs, and he knew that his time was running out. Elias grabbed his personal bag and left through the back exit as the lights in the office began to flicker. He realized that the quiet updates were not just changes to text, but changes to the history of town. The auditor moved to a different county, and he never looked at a digital police log for the rest of life. He heard that Silas Miller was promoted to a high-ranking position within the department a few months after that. The Blackwood mine was officially sealed with concrete in 1998, and all the records were marked as classified. Investigators reportedly found no evidence of foul play, but the mystery of the pulsing blue lights remained for many years. Elias still thinks about the voice on the tape and the way the metallic hum sounded in the dark basement. He knows that some truths are hidden between the lines of a report that has been changed for a purpose. The silent witness of the digital record is the only thing that remembers the original night at the Blackwood mine. This dispatch log remains a strange anomaly in the history of the county, and it is never discussed by officers. It serves as a reminder that what we see on a screen is only as true as the person. The mountains of Colorado are silent, and they keep the secrets of the things that hide inside the old tunnels. Elias Thorne is safe now, but he always checks his own records to ensure they have not been changed recently. The truth is often a quiet thing that sits in a dusty box waiting for someone to find the past. But once the data is updated, the past becomes a ghost that no one can ever truly catch again now. Every change is a small brick in a wall that hides the reality of the world from the many people. Park rangers encountered something they can't explain, missing 411. Rangers at Blackwater National Park documented 47 unexplained disappearances since 1989. All cases shared eerie similarities, including abandoned gear and no signs of struggle. The National Park Service quietly flagged certain trails as high risk without public explanation. Local rangers developed their own coded language for these incidents to avoid unnecessary panic. They called them 411 events, referencing the mysterious nature of each case file number. Elias Thorne tightened his uniform shirt buttons before his morning patrol shift began. He was 29 years old and had served as a full-time park ranger for 3 years. Today, he planned to inspect the remote Ridgeview Trail where 2 hikers vanished last spring. His radio crackled with routine morning check-ins from other rangers across the park. The weather promised clear skies, with temperatures reaching 72 degrees by noon. Elias carried his standard equipment, including camera binoculars and emergency medical kit. His assignment seemed routine, but he couldn't shake the feeling something felt off. The Ridgeview Trail started normally with well-maintained paths winding through dense forest. Birdsong filled the air as Elias checked trail markers for damage or vandalism. He noticed the first anomaly near mile marker 3, where footprints disappeared abruptly. The prints belonged to hiking boots size 11, according to his measurement sketches. Park records showed a hiker named Darnell Wright vanished near the spot in early June. Darnell was 31 and worked as a wildlife photographer from Portland, Oregon. His last known photo showed unusual rock formations just off the main path. Elias photographed the spot where the footprints ended, finding no logical explanation. Elias continued hiking with increased attention to his surroundings, scanning both sides of the trail. He discovered a discarded water bottle partially buried in leaves near a cluster of pine trees. The bottle's label identified it as belonging to a local hiking group active that week. Park logs stated no groups reported issues, but Elias knew some visitors avoided official channels. Nearby, he spotted broken branches arranged in a pattern that didn't match animal activity. The breaks looked deliberate, as if someone had pushed through quickly but carefully. Elias collected the water bottle, placing it in an evidence bag for lab analysis later. He reached the clearing where Darnell Wright was last photographed taking landscape shots. The view offered panoramic vistas of untouched wilderness stretching for miles in every direction. Elias pulled out his notebook, comparing current conditions to archived incident reports. Something troubled him about the official timeline of Darnell's disappearance, according to dispatch logs. Park records claimed no emergency calls came from that area during the critical window, yet Elias found a partial cell tower record showing a dropped call at that location. The call lasted exactly 41 seconds before disconnecting without explanation. Elias decided to follow the broken branches away from the main trail toward a rocky outcrop. The terrain became steeper, requiring careful footing as he navigated loose gravel. At the base of the outcrop, he discovered a small depression in the earth that looked unnatural. Soil samples showed layers mixed in ways that suggested recent disturbance and resettling. Nearby tire tracks led to an unmapped service road barely visible through overgrowth. Park maintenance logs didn't list this road, but Elias recognized the distinctive tread pattern. It matched older park service vehicles retired years ago, according to inventory records. Back at headquarters, Elias reviewed his photos, noticing something he'd missed during the hike. One image captured a reflection in Darnell's abandoned camera lens, showing a vehicle behind trees. The vehicle appeared to be a decommissioned Ranger truck model no longer in service. Elias checked the park's vehicle inventory database, finding discrepancies in several entries. 3 trucks listed as scrapped in 2019 showed recent fuel purchase records. Maintenance logs showed routine service for these vehicles despite official retirement status. This pattern repeated across multiple park locations, raising serious questions. Elias visited retired ranger Martha Claiborne, who lived in a cabin near the park boundary. Martha had served 42 years before retiring in 2021 due to health issues. She welcomed Elias with herbal tea on her porch overlooking the forested hills. At first, she seemed hesitant to discuss the disappearances, preferring general park history stories. But after some gentle questioning, she revealed classified information from her long career. Certain areas experienced rare ground instability that created temporary openings in the earth. The Park Service monitored these zones quietly to prevent public panic and tourism damage. Elias spent days cross-referencing Martha's information with official park documents and geological surveys. He discovered coded entries labeled terrain anomaly near each disappearance location on internal maps. Dispatch logs mentioned routine ground stability checks on those specific trails during critical periods. Public reports always cited hiker error or wildlife encounters instead of geological explanations. Elias found archived witness statements describing strange ground movements before several vanishings. One report from 1998 mentioned the Earth appearing to breathe near Ridgeview Trail. The documentation was marked confidential with restricted access permissions. He requested a meeting with Dr. Lena Petrov, a 63-year-old geophysicist from Western State University. Dr. Petrov specialized in anomalous seismic activity in protected wilderness areas across the country. She examined Elias's soil samples under high-resolution microscopy with professional interest. These soil layers show compression patterns consistent with rapid opening and closing events, she explained. The ground fractures vertically, then seals itself, leaving minimal evidence behind. Dr. Petrov shared her unpublished research showing similar patterns in 7 national parks nationwide. She warned that standard geological surveys often miss these micro-events due to their brief duration. Elias presented his findings to Park Superintendent Nora Vance, who had 58 years. Superintendent Vance possessed 28 years of service experience across multiple Western parks. She listened carefully as Elias laid out evidence, including soil analysis and expert testimony. She confirmed the geological phenomenon existed, but explained why the service kept it quiet. Public knowledge could cause economic damage to gateway communities dependent on tourism revenue. More critically, it might attract dangerous thrill seekers to already vulnerable areas deliberately. Vance showed Elias internal memos detailing previous incidents with similar mysterious patterns documented. Elias learned these areas experienced rare seismic micro-events, creating temporary ground fractures. The Earth would open, swallow objects or people, then close seamlessly within minutes sometimes. Geological surveys confirmed these events occurred every few decades in specific vulnerable zones. Victims sometimes survived landing in shallow air pockets during these brief openings occasionally. Rescue teams recovered some after days of careful excavation efforts in known problem areas. Others were never found, presumed lost in deeper, unstable ground systems permanently. The Park Service developed specific protocols for monitoring these zones without alarming the public. He visited the ranger archives, discovering more cases matching the pattern across different parks. A 1985 incident involved a family of 4 who vanished near Silver Creek Basin. Park records listed them as lost to flash flooding, but weather data showed no rain that week. Elias found a witness statement from a fellow hiker who reported seeing the ground ripple strangely. Another case from 2007 involved a park botanist named Cora Finch. Her final field notes described unusual soil movement before her equipment stopped transmitting. The notes ended mid-sentence with smudged ink as if dropped suddenly. Elias spent nights reviewing old geological surveys that Martha had hinted about during their conversation. He found topographical maps from the 1970s marked with blue circles around trouble spots. The annotations read periodic ground instability zones to be monitored quarterly without public disclosure. Modern digital maps had removed these markings entirely, leaving no trace of the warnings. He discovered maintenance logs showing trail rerouting projects that coincided with disappearance dates. Each time, the park quietly shifted trails away from high-risk areas over several years. The service never closed trails completely, just made them less inviting through subtle landscape changes. He interviewed retired maintenance worker Hank Dobbs, who had worked park infrastructure for 26 years. Hank confirmed seeing strange tire tracks near restricted zones during his night patrols. He recalled being ordered to repair certain roads every spring without official work orders. The ground would look freshly disturbed, like something heavy had driven through recently. Hank showed Elias photos from his personal collection showing equipment parked near ravines. In one picture, the date stamp read May 3, 2018, the same week a hiker vanished nearby. Elias set up motion sensor cameras in the most vulnerable sections of Ridgeview Trail for surveillance. For 4 weeks, he checked them daily, finding nothing unusual until the 5th week. One camera captured footage of the ground rippling at 3:21 in the morning. The soil separated vertically, creating a narrow opening about 4 feet deep. After 47 seconds, it began closing until no evidence remained visible. Elias watched the loop, repeatedly confirming this wasn't a trick of light or animal activity. The footage provided concrete proof of the phenomenon that park officials had quietly managed for decades. He requested another meeting with Superintendent Vance, bringing the camera footage as evidence. This time, she didn't try to explain it away or redirect his questions about protocol. Instead, she shared classified geological reports from the United States Geological Survey. These documents confirmed the existence of temporary fracture zones across several national parks. The phenomenon occurred in areas with specific soil composition and underground water flow patterns. Vance explained their dilemma between public safety and public awareness clearly now. They couldn't warn visitors about something that appeared random and left no trace afterward. Elias understood why rangers couldn't openly discuss the disappearances with casual visitors. Warning signs might not stop curious hikers from exploring off-trail areas recklessly. Media coverage could turn these locations into dangerous tourist attractions immediately. The service focused on prevention through subtle trail modifications and quiet monitoring techniques. They redirected paths slowly over years and avoided building permanent structures nearby carefully. They maintained search protocols while avoiding language that might spark unnecessary public fear. Elias saw the dilemma between public safety and public awareness clearly now. He joined Vance in developing a new monitoring system using underground sensors to detect ground movement. The equipment would alert rangers when instability reached dangerous levels, allowing temporary trail closures. They designed the system to look like standard weather monitoring equipment to avoid drawing attention. Elias trained new rangers on recognizing early signs of ground instability during patrols. He updated trail markers himself, making hazardous zones less inviting to wanderers through clever landscaping. The Park Service implemented these changes across multiple locations with promising results. Now, when Elias hikes the Ridgeview Trail, he moves with quiet, purposeful steps and heightened awareness. He checks soil stability regularly and watches for new cracks appearing in the Earth's surface. He knows the ground holds ancient mysteries older than the park itself by centuries. Some secrets exist not to hide truth, but to protect people from real dangers. The mountains keep their own time and follow their own natural rules consistently. Rangers guard these places with silence, born of responsibility, not deception or secrecy. Elias adds his observations to internal logs for future colleagues to study and use. The disappearances continue, but fewer happen each year through careful stewardship practices. He walks these trails, understanding some answers lie beneath our feet, waiting patiently. In this new story, this recorded call didn't match the timeline. Most people believe that official records are the absolute truth because they are written down and filed away for history. However, an audio technician in 1994 discovered that a single magnetic tape can prove the entire system wrong. Arthur Vance was a 46-year-old man who lived a very quiet life in a small rental house. He worked as a freelance audio engineer who specialized in restoring old or damaged recordings for various local government agencies. His workspace was a cramped basement filled with reel-to-reel players and digital converters that hummed throughout the night. One Tuesday morning, a courier delivered a heavy cardboard box from the county archives that contained dozens of unlabeled cassette tapes. The manifest explained that these were emergency dispatch recordings from the late 1980s that needed to be digitized immediately. Arthur began the tedious process of cleaning the magnetic strips and loading them into his high-end recording equipment. He spent hours listening to mundane reports of noise complaints and minor traffic accidents while the reels spun slowly around. The work was repetitive and boring until he reached a tape that was dated November 12, 1988. He noticed that the timestamp on the digital display indicated the recording began at exactly 9:48 that evening. The audio started with a burst of static that eventually cleared to reveal the sound of a woman breathing heavily. She sounded absolutely terrified, and her voice was a high-pitched whisper that barely registered on the sound levels meter. The woman identified herself as Alara Halloway, and she told the dispatcher that her house was filling with thick smoke. She described the smell of burning plastic and the way the heat was already cracking the glass in her windows. Arthur stopped the recording and checked the box to see if there was any more information about this specific case. He found a small handwritten note that mentioned a fatal house fire in the northern district of the quiet town. The note stated that the Halloway residence had burned to the ground and the case was closed as an accident. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine as he listened to Alara describe the flames licking at the door. He leaned forward and adjusted his headphones to hear the background noises that were hidden beneath her frantic pleas for help. There was a strange, rhythmic tapping sound that did not seem to match the chaotic energy of a spreading house fire. It sounded more like someone was calmly walking across a wooden floor while the woman was trapped in the room. Arthur decided to cross-reference the date of the recording with the official newspaper archives at the local public library. He drove across town and spent several hours scrolling through rolls of microfiche to find any mention of Alara Halloway. He finally found the headline, and it stated that the tragic fire occurred on the night of November 13, 1988. This meant that the recording he just heard was made exactly 24 hours before the actual fire even started. The discrepancy bothered Arthur so much that he could not focus on the rest of the tapes in the archive box. He began to wonder if the date on the tape was simply a clerical error made by the dispatch operator. He returned to his basement and played the recording again while looking for any clues that could explain the timeline. Alara mentioned that she was calling from the kitchen phone because the bedroom line had already been cut by the heat. She also mentioned that the power had gone out and she was using a flashlight to find her way around. Arthur realized that if the fire happened on the 13th, then she should not have been calling on the 12th. He contacted a retired fire investigator named Silas Thayer, who had worked in the county during the 1980s. Silas was 70 years old, and he remembered the Holloway fire because it was one of the strangest cases he handled. He agreed to meet Arthur at a small diner on the edge of town to discuss the details of the investigation. Silas explained that the fire was incredibly intense, and it had completely consumed the structure in less than 20 minutes. He mentioned that the cause was officially listed as a faulty space heater that had tipped over in the living room. Arthur asked Silas if there were any reports of a call coming in on the night before the actual blaze. Silas shook his head and said that the only call they received was on the night of the 13th. The investigator looked at Arthur with a confused expression when he heard about the timestamp on the archived emergency tape. Silas claimed that he had personally reviewed every single log, and there was nothing recorded on the night of the 12th. Arthur went home and spent the entire night analyzing the audio with the most advanced software he had in his studio. He isolated the sound of the background tapping and realized it was actually the sound of a heavy metal lighter. Someone was flicking the lid of a Zippo lighter open and shut in a very deliberate and steady rhythmic pattern. This person was standing very close to the woman while she was begging the dispatcher to send help to her house. Arthur also noticed that there was no sound of a dispatcher talking back to Alara during the entire 5-minute call. The recording was just a one-way stream of audio that had been captured and saved onto the official dispatch reel. This suggested that the call never actually went through to the emergency center and was instead a local recording. Arthur realized that someone must have patched a separate recorder directly into the house lines to capture her final moments. He began to search for any information about Alara Holloway that might explain why she would be targeted this way. He discovered that she was a wealthy widow who lived alone and had recently changed her will to benefit a cousin. The cousin was a man named Julian Holloway, who had a history of gambling debts and various legal troubles in town. Julian had disappeared shortly after the insurance money was paid out, and he was never seen in the county again. Arthur decided to look at the property records to see who had purchased the land where the house once stood. The records showed that the land was still owned by a private trust that was managed by a law firm. Arthur felt like he was uncovering a crime that had been hidden for years behind a wall of official paperwork. He decided to visit the site of the old Holloway house to see if anything remained of the original structure. The forest had mostly reclaimed the area, and the only thing left was a crumbling foundation covered in thick green moss. He walked around the perimeter and found a small metal box that was buried beneath a pile of charred wooden beams. Inside the box was a small handheld cassette recorder that was badly damaged by the heat and the passing years. Arthur took the device back to his studio and spent days trying to recover any data from the internal components. He managed to extract a short clip of audio that was recorded just minutes after the house had finished burning. A man with a deep and gravelly voice was heard laughing as he walked away from the smoldering black ruins. The man mentioned that the rehearsal on the 12th was perfect and the final performance on the 13th was even better. Arthur realized that the recording he found in the archive was actually a rehearsal of the murder from the night before. The killer had forced Alara to act out her own death while he recorded her voice to use as a distraction. He had then played the recording for her on the night of the actual fire to terrify her before he struck. This explained why the tapping of the lighter was so calm and why there was no response from the emergency dispatcher. The killer had likely broken into the records building later to hide the tape among the mundane daily dispatch logs. He probably thought that no one would ever listen to a boring reel from 1988 after so many years. Arthur knew that he had to take this evidence to the police, even if the case was decades old now. He contacted the current sheriff and explained everything he had found on the tapes and at the old house site. The sheriff was skeptical at first, but he agreed to look at the evidence and listen to the restored audio files. They ran a voice analysis on the Laughing Man and compared it to old police interviews with Julian Halloway himself. The match was nearly perfect, and the authorities were able to issue a warrant for the arrest of the cousin. Julian was eventually found living under a false name in a small town 3 states away from the original crime. He was an old man now, but he still carried a silver Zippo lighter in his front pocket every day. When he was confronted with the audio of his own voice, he broke down and confessed to the entire plan. He admitted that he wanted the insurance money, and he thought the rehearsal would help him stay calm during the act. He had accidentally filed the rehearsal tape instead of the actual recording of the fire when he broke into archives. Arthur Vance received a small commendation from the county for his role in solving the cold case after so long. He went back to his basement studio and continued his work of digitizing the history of the small, quiet town. He never looked at an unlabeled tape the same way again because he knew what secrets they might be holding. Sometimes the most important truth is hidden in the silence between the words of an old and forgotten recording. The timeline of a crime can be manipulated by a clever mind, but the sound of the truth remains unchanged. Arthur kept a copy of the tape as a reminder that every voice deserves to be heard eventually. He finally felt a sense of peace, knowing that Alara Halloway had finally received the justice she was denied. The basement was still cold and damp, but the work felt much more important to him than it ever had. He sat down at his desk and picked up the next tape from the heavy cardboard box. The sound of static filled the room as the reels began to spin, and another story waited to be told. Investigation is often a slow process of connecting dots that other people have overlooked or ignored for a long time. Arthur Vance was the only person who looked close enough to see the error that the killer had made years ago. It is a strange thought that a single minute of audio can change the entire history of a tragic event. The recorded call did not match the timeline because it was never meant to be heard by anyone at all. It was a mistake born of arrogance and a belief that the past could be buried in a box. The truth has a way of rising to the surface when the right person is willing to listen closely. Arthur turned off his equipment and walked up the stairs to get a fresh cup of hot black coffee. He looked out the window at the quiet street and wondered how many other secrets were hidden in plain sight. The world is full of stories that are waiting for someone to find the missing piece of the puzzle. He was glad that he was the one who found the tape on that Tuesday morning in the basement. In this new story, the bitter winter of 2020 descended upon the northern forests of Wisconsin with a ferocity that startled the locals. The region was known for its deep lakes and thick ice that could support the weight of heavy pickup trucks. One particular body of water, named Mirror Lake, had a reputation that was whispered about in the local taverns. The lake was perfectly round and sat in a deep bowl of earth surrounded by towering ancient pine trees. It was a popular spot for ice fishing enthusiasts who traveled from all over the state to catch walleye. However, the lake also had a dark history of people vanishing without a trace during the coldest months of the year. The locals called it the grabbing ice because the lake seemed to swallow people whole without leaving any wreckage behind. The mystery had persisted for decades and was usually blamed on thin ice patches caused by underwater natural springs. But the old-timers knew that the springs were mapped and marked clearly to prevent any accidental tragedies from happening. The disappearances always happened in late February, when the ice should have been at its thickest and most stable point. Our story begins with a young couple named Jason and Emily who wanted to spend a weekend on the ice. They rented a luxury ice fishing house that was equipped with heaters and beds and a small kitchen area. They drove their heavy truck onto the frozen surface of the lake just as the sun was beginning to set. The ice cracked and popped under the tires, which was a normal sound that usually unnerved new visitors to the lake. They parked the house near the center of the lake, which was known as the Deep Basin by the fishermen. They set up their tip-ups and drilled holes in the ice to drop their lines into the dark water. The evening passed peacefully with the couple playing cards and enjoying the silence of the isolated winter landscape outside. The trouble began just after midnight when the wind died down and the lake fell into a heavy silence. Emily woke up to hear a strange scratching sound on the aluminum siding of their small portable fishing house. She woke Jason and they listened together as the sound moved from the back of the house to the door. It sounded like someone was dragging a heavy metal object across the corrugated metal surface of the outer wall. Jason grabbed a heavy flashlight and opened the door to investigate the source of the noise in the dark. He stepped out onto the ice and saw nothing but the vast expanse of white snow glowing in the moonlight. He walked around the perimeter of the house and checked the hitch and the propane tanks for any signs of tampering. He found nothing out of the ordinary and assumed it was a loose strap flapping in a sudden draft of wind. He returned inside and locked the door, but the feeling of being watched lingered in the back of his mind. The next morning, a passing ranger noticed that the truck was still parked, but there was no movement inside. The ranger was a man named Sheriff Brody who had patrolled the county for over 30 years of his life. He knew the history of Mirror Lake better than anyone, and he always felt a knot of dread in February. He drove his patrol truck onto the ice to perform a welfare check on the occupants of the rental house. He knocked on the door but received no answer from inside the cabin, so he tried the handle and entered. The interior was warm and the heater was still running, but the couple was nowhere to be found in the house. Their phones were sitting on the small table and a pot of coffee was boiling away on the gas stove. It looked as if they had stepped out for a second and simply never returned to the safety of the room. Brody walked back outside and scanned the snow for footprints that might lead away from the fishing house. He found 2 sets of tracks leading about 50 feet away from the house toward a cluster of pressure ridges. The tracks stopped abruptly in the middle of a flat patch of snow with no signs of a struggle or fall. It was as if the couple had been lifted into the sky by a giant hand and carried away completely. Brody called for backup, and a search team arrived within the hour to comb the surface of the lake. They brought dogs and underwater cameras to check the holes that had been drilled by the missing couple earlier. The cameras showed nothing but the murky green water and the fish swimming lazily near the bottom of the lake. The ice in the area where the tracks ended was tested and found to be over 2 feet thick. There was no hole for them to fall through and no cracks large enough to swallow a human being whole. The case was baffling, and it mirrored the other disappearances that had happened on the lake in the past years. Brody decided to dig deeper into the history of the lake and the timing of the strange events. He went back to the station and pulled the files for every missing person case related to Mirror Lake since the 80s. He noticed a pattern that he had missed before because the cases were spread out over so many years. The disappearances always occurred on the weekend of the new moon when the nights were at their darkest point. They also happened in the same specific quadrant of the lake, which was the deepest part of the basin. Brody realized that this was not a random natural phenomenon, but something that was calculated and perhaps even man-made. He decided to return to the lake that night alone to stake out the area and watch for anything unusual. He parked his truck in the tree line on the shore and used high-powered binoculars to watch the ice. The night was freezing cold and the temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero as the hours ticked by slowly. The lake was empty of fishermen because the news of the disappearance had scared everyone away for the time being. Just after 2 in the morning, Brody saw a faint light appear in the center of the dark lake. It was not a flashlight or a lantern, but a soft blue glow that seemed to come from the ice. He watched as a dark figure emerged from the shadows of the pressure ridges and walked toward the blue light. The figure was carrying a long pole and appeared to be working on something on the surface of the ice. Brody started his truck and drove onto the lake with his headlights off to get closer to the suspect. The sound of his tires on the snow was muffled by the wind that had started to pick up again. He stopped the truck 100 yards away and continued on foot with his service weapon drawn and ready. He crept closer and realized that the blue light was coming from under the ice through a large rectangular hole. The figure was using a specialized saw to cut a massive block of ice out of the surface of the lake. Brody watched in horror as the man pushed the block of ice down into the water and slid it under the sheet. This created a perfectly square open water trap that was hidden by a thin layer of snow on top. The man then placed a reflective marker near the hole that would likely be invisible to a casual observer walking by. This was how the couple had vanished without leaving a trace of a struggle or a broken ice edge. They had walked onto a section of the lake that looked solid but was actually a deadly open water trap. The man was resetting the trap for the next victim who might wander out to check their tip-ups at night. Brody stepped out of the darkness and shouted for the man to freeze and put his hands in the air. The man spun around and dropped the saw into the water before trying to run toward a waiting snowmobile. Brody tackled the man on the slippery ice and handcuffed him before he could reach the safety of his machine. The suspect turned out to be a local man named Garrett, who owned a failing resort on the other side. Garrett had been losing business for years and had developed a twisted plan to scare people away from the competition. He believed that if he created a legend of a cursed lake, people would stay at his inland cabins instead. But the plan had spiraled out of control when people actually started falling into his traps and dying in the water. He had been disposing of the bodies by weighting them down and dropping them into the deepest part of the lake. The blue light that Brody had seen was a waterproof lure that Garrett used to attract the fish and the victims. The investigation revealed that Garrett had been responsible for at least 5 disappearances over the last 15 years on the lake. He knew the ice better than anyone and used his knowledge to create the perfect murder weapon using the environment. He would cut the holes on the dark nights and then let them freeze over by morning to hide the evidence. The thin ice that formed over the hole would look like the rest of the lake, but would break instantly. The reason the tracks ended abruptly was that the victims fell straight down into the freezing water without a sound. Garrett would then return to the scene to cover the hole with fresh snow and remove any floating debris. It was a chillingly efficient method that relied on the natural dangers of the winter to do the dirty work. Brody felt a sickness in his stomach as he realized the true nature of the evil that lived in his town. The mystery of the grabbing ice was solved, but the cost was a legacy of pain for the families. The authorities brought in a dive team to search the area where Garrett had confessed to dropping the victims into the deep. The recovery operation took weeks because of the extreme cold and the dangerous conditions of diving under the thick ice. They eventually recovered the bodies of Jason and Emily, along with 3 others who had been missing for years. The town was in shock that one of their own could commit such heinous acts for the sake of money. Garrett was charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The resort was seized by the state and eventually demolished to erase the memory of the man who lived there. Mirror Lake remained closed for the rest of the winter season as the community tried to heal from the trauma. The story of the frozen lake mystery spread across the country and became a warning to ice fishermen everywhere. It taught people to always check the ice thickness and to never trust a patch of snow that looks too perfect. The legend of the supernatural curse was replaced by the terrifying reality of human greed and cruelty in the cold. Brody retired the following year, but he never went back out onto the ice of Mirror Lake for the rest of his life. He could still see the blue glow of the light coming from under the ice in his nightmares at night. The lake eventually returned to being a peaceful place for fishing, but the locals never forgot the history of the water. They placed a memorial marker on the shore to honor the victims who had lost their lives in the cold. The marker simply listed the names and the dates and a warning to respect the power of the frozen water. The button of the story is the lingering fear that haunts the visitors who come to the lake today. Even though the killer is behind bars, there is a sense of unease when the sun goes down over the ice. The wind still howls across the basin and creates sounds that resemble scratching on the walls of the fishing houses. Fishermen tell stories of seeing lights under the ice that move and follow them as they walk back to shore. It is likely just a reflection of the moon or a trick of the mind played by the isolation. But for those who know the story of Garrett and his saw, it is a reminder to watch your step carefully. The ice is a shifting and changing surface that can hide secrets deep below the frost line for a long time. The mystery is solved, but the atmosphere of the lake remains charged with the energy of the tragedy that happened. We often look for monsters in the dark corners of the woods or in the depths of the ocean. But sometimes the monster is just a man with a tool and a reason to do something terrible to others. The final detail that the police found in Garrett's cabin was a map of the lake with dates written on it. He had planned out the locations of his traps years in advance to maximize the terror and the mystery effect. He treated the lake like a game board where he controlled the pieces and the outcome of the night. It was a level of premeditation that shocked even the most experienced detectives who worked on the case that year. The frozen lake was his weapon and his graveyard, and he ruled it with a cold and indifferent hand. The winter season eventually passed, and the ice melted away to reveal the dark blue water of the lake again. The loons returned to nest on the shore, and the boats replaced the ice houses on the surface of the water. Life returned to normal in the small town, but the memory of the winter of 2020 remained frozen in time. The story serves as a testament to the dedication of Sheriff Brody, who refused to believe in ghosts or curses. He looked into the darkness and found the truth that everyone else was too afraid to see or acknowledge. And somewhere in the deep basin of the lake, there are likely still secrets that were never found by the divers. The water keeps its own counsel and covers the past with a layer of silence that is hard to break. The frozen lake mystery that kept happening was finally stopped, but the scars on the community will last forever. It is a story that is told around campfires to remind us that safety is an illusion we create for ourselves. And when you walk on water that is turned to stone, you are walking on a very thin line indeed. In this news story, this voicemail was played too late. Quentin Sterling was a 54-year-old man who spent his weekends hunting for vintage electronics in small towns. He lived in a quiet suburb of Portland and worked as a technician for a high-end audio repair shop. His workshop was a crowded room filled with the smell of warm solder and old dust from ancient television sets. He loved the way that old vacuum tubes glowed with a soft orange light when they were finally powered up. Quentin often felt that modern digital devices were cold and lacked the soul of the mechanical machines from the past. He spent his Saturday mornings driving to remote estate sales where he could find hidden gems in the cluttered garages. The rain was pouring down on the morning of November 12th in the year 2003 when he drove his old truck through the winding mountain roads until he reached a secluded house near the rugged coast. The driveway was overgrown with thick weeds, and the paint on the siding was peeling away in long and jagged. The house belonged to a woman named Beatrice Lang, who had recently passed away at the age of 82. Quentin walked through the damp house and looked at the items that were laid out on the dusty folding tables. He found an old Panasonic answering machine tucked away in a cardboard box under a pile of moth-eaten blankets. The device was covered in a thick layer of gray grime, and the plastic casing was yellowed by many years. He noticed that a micro-cassette tape was still sitting inside the machine, and the message counter showed a number 1. Quentin paid the $5 and drove back to his home while the rain continued to hit the metal roof. He was eager to see if the tape contained any recordings that had been forgotten by the previous lonely owner. He spent the next hour cleaning the internal components of the machine with a small brush and some rubbing alcohol. The drive belt was cracked and brittle, so he replaced it with a new rubber band from his spare parts. He plugged the unit into a power transformer and watched as the small red light began to blink very slowly. The rhythm of the blinking light felt like a heartbeat that was trying to tell him a story from history. Quentin pressed the play button and heard the sound of heavy static and the faint clicking of the tape reel. A woman began to speak in a high-pitched whisper that sounded like she was hiding in a small closet. She said that she had finally reached the safe house and she was waiting for someone named Arthur to arrive. The voice belonged to a woman named Evelyn Vance, who had disappeared during a massive winter storm in 1990. The official police record stated that Evelyn had vanished on the night of December 14th after leaving a local holiday. Her car had been found abandoned on a lonely stretch of highway with the doors locked and the keys inside. However, the timestamp on the answering machine clearly stated that the message was recorded on December 16, 1990. This meant that Evelyn was still alive and calling for help 2 full days after the search was officially ended. Quentin felt a cold sensation in his chest as he realized that he was listening to a ghost from history. He decided to visit the local library to look through the archived newspapers for any mention of the Vance family. He spent several hours scrolling through rolls of microfilm until he found the headlines from the winter of 1990. The papers described Evelyn as a popular woman who worked as a teacher at the local elementary school in town. Her husband was a man named Julian Vance, who served as the county commissioner and was a very powerful figure. Julian had led the search parties himself, and he was often seen crying on the evening news for his wife. Quentin noticed a small detail in a photograph of the car that had been published in the local newspaper edition. The driver's side window was cracked, and there were small fragments of glass on the shoulder of the road nearby. He wondered why the police had never mentioned the broken glass in their final report on the missing person case. Quentin decided to contact a retired detective named Silas Thorne, who had worked on the original investigation back then. Silas lived in a small trailer park on the edge of the woods, and he spent his days fishing alone. He invited Quentin inside and listened to the recording on the old answering machine with a look of pure disbelief. Silas explained that the investigation had been cut short by the department because they lacked any evidence of a crime. He admitted that he had always felt that something was wrong with the way that Julian Vance had acted then. Julian had pushed the police to close the case as a tragic accident caused by the severe winter weather conditions. Silas and Quentin decided to go back to the old Beatrice Lang house to search for any other hidden clues. They walked through the overgrown yard and found a small wooden door that was hidden beneath a pile of leaves. The door led to a small cellar that was located directly beneath the kitchen of the main house structure above. The air in the basement was cold and smelled of damp earth and the faint scent of dried flower petals. They found a small room that had been furnished with a simple wooden bed and a small table and lamp. On the table sat a stack of letters that were addressed to a man named Arthur Sterling from many years. Quentin realized that Arthur was his own uncle who had died in a car accident in 1991 suddenly. The letters revealed that Beatrice had helped Evelyn hide in the basement to escape from her abusive husband, Julian Vance. Julian had been violent toward Evelyn for many years, and she knew that the police would never help her out. She had staged the car accident on the highway and walked 3 miles through the snow to reach the house. Beatrice was a distant relative who agreed to keep her safe until Arthur could drive her to the Canadian border. The voicemail on the machine was meant to tell Arthur that she was ready to leave on the 16th morning. However, Arthur never arrived because he was killed in a separate accident on the very same day of the call. Beatrice had kept Evelyn hidden for several weeks until she finally managed to get her a new set of papers. Evelyn had moved to a different country and started a new life under a name that no one would recognize. Quentin found a small photograph tucked inside the last letter that showed Evelyn standing on a sunny and warm beach. She looked happy and healthy, and she was holding a small child who had the same eyes as her family. Silas Thorne felt a sense of peace, knowing that the woman he had tried to find was actually still. He realized that his intuition about the case was correct, and the husband had been the real monster all along. The truth had been sitting in a cardboard box for 13 years, waiting for someone to find the right tape. Quentin took the machine back to his studio and placed it on the shelf next to his most prized possessions. He knew that the message was played too late for Arthur, but it was just in time to clear history. The story of Evelyn Vance was no longer a mystery, but a tale of survival and the kindness of strangers. Quentin turned off the lights and listened to the sound of the rain against the window in the quiet night. He realized that every old machine has a memory, and sometimes they just need a little bit of help speaking. The world is full of voices that are waiting to be heard in the silence of the long and forgotten. He sat in his chair and thought about the cousin who risked everything to help a woman in desperate need. The records might be wrong, but the human heart always finds a way to leave a mark on the world. He felt glad that he had paid the $5 for the dusty box at the Rainey estate sale then. The voicemail was a final piece of a puzzle that had been missing for a very long and lonely time. He would never forget the sound of the woman who whispered her hope into a small plastic machine in '90. The static of the past had finally cleared, and the truth was standing in the bright light of the day. Park rangers admit something is wrong in these parks. The first disappearance I ever responded to felt ordinary at the beginning, the kind every ranger expects sooner or later. A hiker failed to return by sunset. The weather was calm, and the trail was wide, marked, and familiar. Everyone assumed it would end with a routine rescue and a quiet lecture about preparation. At that point, I had already spent several years working in national parks. I trusted procedures, maps, and experience because they had never failed me before. We mobilized quickly, established search grids, and brought in tracking dogs while the scent window was still fresh. Nothing about the call suggested danger beyond mild exposure or disorientation. The dogs tracked confidently for nearly a mile. Then they stopped. There was no water crossing, no rock face, no cliff, and no sudden change in terrain. Ahead of them was an open meadow with low grass and scattered trees. Wind moved gently across the field, but not enough to erase scent so completely. The dogs did not slow down or lose interest. They simply stopped, as if the trail had ended in midair. Handlers tried again from a different angle, circling wide and restarting the track. The result was the same. The dogs followed confidently, reached the same invisible line, and refused to go farther. They did not whine or panic. They sat down and looked back at us. That moment stayed with me long after the search paused for the night. At the time, I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Wind shift, thermal lift. Something technical we would understand later once we reviewed conditions more carefully. Over the years, I learned that this moment was not unique. Across different parks in different states, similar cases began to stack up quietly. On paper, every incident looked different. Different people, different weather, different terrain. But standing in the field with a radio in my hand, the similarities became impossible to ignore. These cases almost always began calmly. A child wandered a few steps ahead on a boardwalk trail. Parents looked away for seconds to adjust a bag, then turned back to nothing. An experienced hunter missed a scheduled check-in despite having proper gear and years of knowledge. A hiker separated briefly from a group on a popular trail and never reappeared. In the first hours of each search, everything behaved normally. Trails were clear. Visibility was good. Dogs worked strong scent trails. Helicopters prepared flight paths. Rangers moved confidently, expecting exhaustion, injury, or a simple navigation error. Then, the first inconsistency appeared. Sometimes it was a personal item placed where it should not be. Boots standing upright in an open clearing, a jacket folded neatly on a rock despite incoming weather, a backpack positioned beside a trail with no sign of panic, struggle, or urgency. Rangers know the difference between accidental loss and deliberate placement. These scenes did not look chaotic. They looked paused, as if movement stopped mid-decision rather than ending suddenly. Tracking behavior added to the unease. Dogs that should have followed scent for miles stopped abruptly in open ground. Not near water, not near rock, not near elevation changes. Just stopped. Handlers described confusion, not fatigue. The dogs circled, sat, or pulled back toward their handlers. The scent did not weaken gradually. It simply ended. Distance became another problem. Children were found miles away across terrain that should have slowed them dramatically. Elderly hikers appeared at elevations requiring strength and endurance they did not possess. Time and movement stopped aligning logically with human capability. Some missing people were later found in areas that had already been searched thoroughly. Rangers logged this as delayed discovery, but the memory lingered. Many of us remembered standing in those same places earlier, convinced nothing was there. Official explanations always existed. Wind shifts, animal interference, terrain complexity, delayed discovery, sudden weather changes. These explanations were often correct and usually sufficient, but sometimes they felt incomplete. As these cases accumulated, subtle changes appeared during searches themselves. Radios lost signal only in narrow zones. GPS units drifted slightly, just enough to matter. Batteries drained faster than expected. These problems resolved the moment teams moved out of certain areas. Terrain interference explained part of it. What unsettled us was repetition. Sound behaved strangely as well. Voices echoed from the wrong direction. Shouts vanished entirely in places where sound should have carried. Searchers reported hearing movement in brush that never produced animals or people. None of this went into reports. Rangers are trained to reduce panic, not invite it. Public fear complicates rescues and creates more victims. So, we documented facts and followed protocol, even when the facts felt unfinished. Over time, even experienced rangers noticed changes in themselves. Subtle disorientation that did not match fatigue. Moments where time felt compressed during grid searches. A quiet sense of awareness that faded as soon as we left certain locations. Feelings do not belong in official documentation. A ranger who writes feelings instead of facts does not remain a ranger for long. After enough years, some of us began to admit quietly, only among trusted colleagues, that certain parks produced cases that did not behave correctly. Not supernatural, not malicious, just wrong. And once that realization takes hold, it never fully leaves. This is where the silence begins. As years pass, rangers learn which questions they can ask out loud and which ones must remain internal. Officially, every disappearance receives a category and a timeline. Exposure, accident, medical event, navigation error. These labels keep reports clean and reassure the public that systems are working. Unofficially, patterns begin to form. Veteran rangers notice that certain environments appear again and again in unresolved cases. Boulder fields where sound behaves strangely and distance feels distorted. Talus slopes that shift underfoot and swallow noise. Dense berry patches where visibility collapses in seconds even on clear days. Creek systems that vanish underground and reappear far away, changing direction without warning. None of these places are secret. None are rare. Thousands of visitors move through them safely every year. What unsettles rangers is how often disappearances cluster near them across different parks and different decades. Timing becomes another quiet pattern. Many cases unfold during transitions. Late afternoon sliding into evening, clear skies giving way to sudden fog, calm mornings followed by storms that isolate one person while leaving nearby groups untouched. Rangers describe it as the moment when the park changes personality without announcing it. Searches begin quickly, sometimes within minutes. Dogs lock onto scent confidently, pulling hard on leads. Then, without warning, the trail ends. Not gradually, not near water. Not at cliffs. In open terrain where scent should disperse slowly. Handlers describe the same behavior again and again. The dogs circle, sit down, or turn back toward their handlers. They are not tired, they are confused, the scent does not fade. It simply stops making sense. Rangers expand grids, check drainages, climb ridges, and revisit areas already cleared. Helicopters fly tight patterns overhead. Hours turn into days. Still, nothing appears. Then sometimes, evidence returns. A body is discovered in a place that had already been searched multiple times. Clothing appears after storms that should have buried it deeper. Footprints reemerge in snow where wind should have erased everything. Rangers document delayed discovery and move on. Internally, they remember standing there before. Technology begins to misbehave during these searches in subtle ways. Radios lose signal only in narrow zones. GPS units drift just enough to matter. Battery life shortens unexpectedly. These issues resolve immediately once teams leave specific areas. Terrain interference explains part of it. Rangers accept that explanation. What unsettles them is repetition tied to disappearances. Sound becomes unreliable as well. Voices echo from incorrect directions. Shouts vanish entirely. Searchers hear movement in brush that never produces animals or people. When teams stop, the sound stops. When they move, it resumes at the same distance. None of this belongs in reports. Some of the most difficult cases involve recoveries rather than losses. Children found alive days later are sometimes calm, minimally dehydrated, and unable to explain where they were. They repeat phrases that do not align with time past. They describe hiding from weather that never came or following sounds they cannot describe clearly. Medical explanations exist: stress responses, memory disruption, effects of cold. Rangers accept these explanations publicly. Privately, they notice how often survivors are found uphill, beyond logical travel routes, in places already searched. Rangers also begin to notice changes in themselves during certain searches. Subtle disorientation that does not match fatigue, a feeling that time compresses during grid work, moments of heightened awareness without clear cause. Some describe a sense of being watched, not threatening, but attentive. These sensations vanish when leaving specific areas. No ranger writes this down. A ranger who documents feelings instead of facts does not last long in the job. So these cases accumulate quietly, each one filed, each one explained, each one leaving behind small unanswered questions that settle into memory. At some point, the pattern becomes impossible to dismiss internally. Not dramatic, not conspiratorial, just consistent. This is when rangers begin to admit to each other, carefully and privately, that something feels wrong in certain parks. Not wrong enough to close them, not wrong enough to issue warnings, wrong enough to change how they move, how they listen, and how seriously they take instincts they once ignored. And the silence grows heavier. By the time rangers reach the later years of their careers, certainty becomes quieter. Not weaker, but more careful. They have seen enough to know that not every problem announces itself clearly, and not every answer fits inside a report. This is usually when the admission happens, not publicly, but internally. Something feels wrong. Not wrong in a way that suggests monsters or myths, wrong in a way that suggests gaps. Gaps in understanding, gaps in perception, gaps between how humans expect the land to behave and how it sometimes does. Rangers begin to realize that experience does not eliminate risk. In some cases, it sharpens it. Familiarity creates assumptions. Assumptions create blind spots. And blind spots are where many of these disappearances seem to occur. They reflect on how often missing people were confident, experienced hikers, skilled hunters, children raised outdoors, people who knew the rules and followed them, people who should have been fine. They think about how often these individuals vanished during moments that seemed insignificant. A short separation, a quick decision, a slight deviation from the trail. Seconds, not minutes. The land did the rest. Over time, rangers adjust how they work in subtle ways. They double back more often. They linger in areas that feel quiet in the wrong way. They pay attention to moments when sound drops or when the environment feels unusually still. They trust instincts sooner, even when those instincts cannot be explained logically. They also become more cautious with promises. When families ask how someone could disappear so completely, rangers choose words carefully. They speak about vast terrain, rapid weather changes, and how evidence can be missed even by trained teams. They offer compassion without speculation. What they do not say is that sometimes the land does not give answers back. After retirement, some rangers finally speak more openly. Not in dramatic statements, but in long conversations, interviews, or quiet recordings meant to preserve experience rather than provoke fear. They reject simple explanations at both extremes. Not every disappearance is mysterious. Most are tragic but explainable, but not all. They speak about limits. Limits of tracking dogs when scent behaves unpredictably. Limits of technology in complex terrain. Limits of human perception under stress. Limits of how quickly teams can respond when conditions shift suddenly. They admit that there are places where these limits overlap. Places where sound bends, where distance deceives, where weather isolates one person while sparing another only yards away. Places where a few steps are enough to break every assumption about safety. The parks are not malicious. They are indifferent. They operate on scales of time, geology, and weather that do not align with human expectations. Most days, this difference is harmless. On rare days, it becomes decisive. Rangers continue their work anyway. They update protocols, they train harder, they push for better communication systems and faster response times. They do everything within their control to reduce risk. Still, when a disappearance follows the familiar pattern, the same quiet realization returns. Some cases cannot be explained fully with what we know now. Admitting that does not mean giving up. It means respecting uncertainty. It means acknowledging that confidence without awareness can be more dangerous than fear. Park rangers admit something is wrong in these parks, not because they want to scare visitors away, but because they understand the cost of pretending everything always makes sense. Their unspoken message remains simple. Stay together. Respect closures. Do not rush decisions. Pay attention when the environment feels different, even if you cannot explain why. Because sometimes the wilderness does not take people loudly. Sometimes it takes them quietly, efficiently, and without leaving a reason behind. And the most honest thing a ranger can say after a lifetime of searching is that not every disappearance is ready to be understood yet. In this new story, this security tape played back something else. Public records from the autumn of 2012 describe a very strange incident involving a forgotten storage facility vault. This specific case reminds investigators that the most terrifying sights are often the ones that are recorded on old tape. Leland Voss was a 45-year-old security officer who worked the graveyard shift at the Oak Haven Archive Center. He spent his long nights patrolling rows of metal shelves and drinking hot tea from a very dented silver thermos. The facility was located in a remote part of upstate New York where the winters were always long and harsh. Leland liked the quiet nature of his job because it allowed him to think without any interruptions from the world. He usually arrived at 10 o'clock in the evening and stayed until the cold sun began to rise over hills. The archive stored thousands of boxes filled with legal documents and historical records for various large and powerful law firms. On a rainy Monday in 2012, Leland noticed a flickering light coming from the old security monitor bank deck. The facility still used analog VHS tapes for the backup system because the owners were very slow to adopt technology. Leland reached out and pressed the eject button on the machine to see which tape was currently inside the plastic drive. A black plastic cassette popped out, but it did not have the standard white label used by the security team. Instead, the word "watch" was written in thick black marker across the top of the dusty and scratched plastic casing. Leland felt a strange sensation in his chest as he pushed the tape back into the player to see footage. The screen flickered with static for several seconds before a clear image of the main basement hallway finally appeared on monitor. Leland saw a man walking through the hallway, and he realized the man was wearing a very outdated security uniform. The footage showed the man stopping in front of a heavy steel door that had been welded shut for decades. Leland leaned forward to check the timestamp on the bottom of the screen, and his blood suddenly turned very cold. The date on the security tape was for a Tuesday night in 2012, which was the next day. Leland watched the man on the screen pull a heavy set of keys from his belt and unlock the door. The man looked nervous and kept glancing over his shoulder as if he felt a presence in the dark hallway. Leland realized that he was watching a recording of events that had not yet happened in his own current timeline. He paused the video and paced around the small room while trying to find a logical reason for the tape. It was impossible for an analog tape to record a future event unless someone was playing a very elaborate trick. Leland used his radio to call the site manager, a man named Silas Thorne, but the line was only static. The heavy rain outside was turning into a violent thunderstorm that shook the metal walls of the isolated archives building. He decided to investigate the basement hallway to see if the welded door was actually still sealed and very secure. Leland carried a heavy flashlight and a set of keys as he stepped into the dark and echoing elevator car. The descent to the basement felt like it took much longer than usual as the cables groaned in the shaft. He walked past rows of empty shelves while the shadows danced along the walls in the dim and flickering light. Every few steps, Leland stopped to listen for the sound of breathing or footsteps coming from the darkness around him. He found nothing but the sound of water dripping from a leaky pipe onto the cold and gray concrete floor. When he reached the end of the hallway, he found the heavy steel door exactly as it had always been. The welds were thick and rusted, and there was no way for a standard key to open the solid metal. Leland touched the cold surface of the door and felt a strange vibration that seemed to come from deep within. He decided to return to the security office to watch the rest of the mysterious tape to see what happened. As he walked back toward the elevator, he heard a faint metallic clicking sound echoing from the far end of hall. Leland turned his flashlight toward the noise, but he saw only the empty corridor and the thick layers of dust. He hurried back to the office and pressed the play button to continue watching the grainy and flickering security footage. The man on the screen had finally opened the door and was stepping into a room filled with light. The camera was now showing the interior of a room that Leland had never seen in any of the blueprints. The walls were lined with large glass jars, and each jar contained a glowing blue substance that lit the entire area. The man on the screen approached one of the jars and reached out to touch the smooth and cold glass surface. Suddenly, the man turned toward the camera, and Leland saw that the face was an exact match of his own. The version of Leland on the screen looked directly into the lens and began to speak in a low voice. There was no audio on the tape, but the man was clearly mouthing the words for Leland to get out. Leland felt a wave of pure terror as he realized the tape was a warning meant specifically for his eyes. He grabbed his coat and ran toward the main exit, but the electronic locks had already been engaged by system. Thorne was trapped inside the security office while the monitors began to display live feeds from every single room in building. In every room, a version of himself was standing still and staring directly into the various hidden security camera lenses. He realized the archive was not just storing documents, but was also a facility for some kind of strange experiment. Leland began to smash the monitors with his heavy metal flashlight to stop the sight of his own staring faces. He finally broke through the glass of the main window and leaped out into the cold and pouring night rain. He ran toward his truck and drove away from the facility without ever looking back at the dark and looming structure. Leland reached the nearest police station an hour later and told the officers everything that he had seen on tape. The police returned to the Oakhaven archives with Leland, but they found the facility was completely empty and very quiet. The site manager, Silas Thorne, claimed that no security guard named Leland Voss had ever worked at the private storage company. The police checked the employment records and found that the position had been vacant for over 3 years before that night. Leland showed them the security office, but the analog tape player was missing and the monitors were all perfectly intact. There was no broken glass on the floor, and the heavy steel door in the basement was still welded shut. The police told Leland that he was likely suffering from exhaustion and suggested that he go home to rest well. Leland knew what he had seen, and he refused to ever return to the town of Oakhaven for any reason. He moved to a different state and changed his name to escape the feeling of being watched by his own. The investigation into the archives revealed that the property was owned by a shell company with no actual physical address. No one could explain who had been paying the electricity bills or who had hired the previous security guards there. Leland eventually found a small piece of paper in his coat pocket that he had taken from the office desk. On the paper was a list of names, and his own name was at the very bottom of the list. Next to his name was a date for 2012 and a single word that simply said completed in red. Leland realized that he was part of something much larger than a simple job at a document storage facility center. He spends his days now in a small town where he avoids every single camera and every electronic device possible. He still wonders if the man on the tape was really him or something else entirely from another world. The archives building was eventually torn down in 2015 to make room for a new shopping center development. Construction workers reported finding a large basement room filled with broken glass jars and a faint blue glowing powder residue. No records were ever found to explain what was being stored in those jars or why they were so hidden. The mystery of the security tape remains a topic of discussion among local residents who remember the strange night perfectly. Leland Voss continues to live in the shadows, and he never stays in one place for more than a month. He knows that the eyes on the other side of the screen are still looking for their next target now. The truth of that night is buried under the concrete of the new mall, and it will stay there. Some stories are better left untold, and some tapes should never be played back in a dark and quiet room. Leland often thinks about the metallic clicking sound he heard in the basement hallway on that very rainy and dark night. He wonders if it was the sound of a camera shutter or the sound of a key turning in lock. The world is full of things that we cannot see until they are captured on a piece of magnetic tape. We must be careful about what we choose to watch because the footage might be watching us back in return. The Oakhaven Archives case is a reminder that the past and the future can sometimes meet in a strange way. Leland Voss is a man who saw his own future, and it was enough to make him run forever now. He is safe for now, but he knows the red light of the camera is always waiting to blink. The silence of the night is no longer a comfort to him because he knows what hides in dark. His story is one of many that the public will never truly understand or believe without seeing the physical proof. But the proof was on that tape, and the tape has disappeared into the void of the mysterious shell company. Leland stays away from the mountains and the forests where the shadows are long and the air is very thin. He prefers the bright lights of the city where he can hide in the middle of a large crowd. But even there, he feels the gaze of the lenses that are mounted on the corners of every building. He is a witness to a reality that most people would find impossible to accept in their daily lives. The tape was a message, and the message was received with a loud and very clear warning to run. He did exactly what the man on the screen told him to do, and he is still running today. The memory of the glowing jars and the silent faces is something that will stay with him until the end. He sometimes wakes up in the middle of the night and thinks he hears the hum of a recording deck. But it is only the wind or the sound of the traffic in the street outside of his window. Leland Voss is a survivor of a strange event that defies every single law of time and space today. He keeps his head down, and he never looks at his own reflection for more than a few short seconds. The man on the tape is still there somewhere in the digital or analog ghost of the old archives vault. And somewhere out there, the tape is waiting for the next person to press the play button in dark. This quiet 911 call ended too soon, but the recording will play on in the minds of those involved in this news story. This photo was taken minutes before everything stopped. The historical records from 1986 describe a quiet coastal village where time seemed to simply stand still one day. This specific case reminds local residents that a single photograph can hold more weight than 1,000 spoken and written words. Barnaby Kroll was a 48-year-old archivist who spent his quiet days organizing dusty documents for the town society. On a warm Saturday in 1986, he attended the annual summer festival to capture images for the future generations. The salty ocean air was thick with the scent of fried dough and the distant sound of a local brass band. Barnaby adjusted his heavy camera strap as he walked through the crowd of laughing families and excited children near the pier. He was tasked with documenting the joy of the community before the long and lonely winter months arrived once again soon. The town was small, and everyone knew each other by name and occupation, which made the archive work very personal today. While Barnaby was walking near the old lighthouse, he found a discarded camera sitting on a weathered and salt-stained bench. The camera was an expensive model that seemed out of place in such a humble and quiet little fishing village community. He picked up the heavy device and noticed that the film counter was currently sitting on the very last available frame. Barnaby decided to take one final photo of the harbor to finish the roll before trying to find the rightful owner. He looked through the glass viewfinder and saw the entire town square filled with people who were suddenly and completely silent. The brass band had stopped playing, and the children were no longer running around the bright and colorful carnival games nearby. Barnaby pressed the shutter button and heard a sharp and metallic sound that echoed across the empty and very still harbor. The air became cold, and the vibrant colors of the festival seemed to fade into a dull and muted shade of gray. Barnaby looked around, but he could not find a single person who was moving or breathing in the entire town square. He walked toward the center of the crowd and reached out to touch the shoulder of a man named Thaddeus Thorne. Thaddeus was the local police chief, and he was frozen in place while holding a half-eaten hot dog in hand. The chief felt cold like a statue made of marble, and his eyes were fixed on a point far out at. Barnaby felt a surge of panic as he realized that the world had stopped moving the moment he took that photograph. He clutched the mysterious camera to his chest and began to run toward his office at the Historical Society building nearby. The building was a 3-story brick structure that had served as the local library and archive center for over 50 years. Barnaby fumbled with his keys and entered the dark room, which was located in the quiet and very dusty basement of the building. He worked quickly to develop the film from the camera because he needed to see what the image actually captured that day. The chemicals smelled strong, and the red light cast long and dancing shadows against the damp and peeling walls of the room. As the final image began to appear on the paper, Barnaby saw something that defied every law of physics and logic. The photo did not show the people of 1986, but instead showed a town that was completely and utterly. The buildings were all crumbled, and the harbor was filled with the rusted remains of ships that had long ago sunk. Barnaby grabbed his magnifying glass and leaned closer to the photograph to examine the details of the ruined and abandoned town square. He noticed a figure standing in the doorway of the Historical Society and realized that the person was actually himself. As the version of Barnaby in the photograph looked much older and was wearing a tattered and very dirty brown archive uniform. He was holding a leather-bound book that Barnaby recognized as the master ledger of the entire town of Oak Haven Archives. This ledger contained the names of every person who had lived in the village since its founding in 1842. Barnaby realized that the camera was not taking pictures of the present, but was capturing glimpses of a dark future. He needed to find the ledger to see if there was any mention of a day when everything simply stopped moving. He ran upstairs to the main archive room and began to search through the heavy wooden shelves for the master ledger book. The room was silent, and the dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that were frozen on the floorboards today. Barnaby found the book tucked behind a collection of old maritime maps, and he carried it to his large oak desk. He flipped through the yellowed pages until he reached the entries for the month of August in 1986. The handwriting was his own, and it described the preparations for the summer festival in great and very meticulous detail indeed. He reached the page for today and saw that the ink ended abruptly in the middle of a single unfinished. The final words on the page said that the archives would be closed because something was coming from the deep ocean. According to witness statements collected by the state authorities later, the town had been experiencing strange and unusual seismic activity recently. The local fishermen reported that the water in the harbor had turned a dark shade of violet just before the festival began. Barnaby remembered hearing a low and constant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very soles of his heavy leather boots. He looked out the window and saw that the ocean had completely vanished from the horizon in a single silent moment. The seabed was exposed and covered in strange and glowing plants that pulsed with a rhythmic and very hypnotic blue light. He realized that the photograph he took had captured the exact second that the town was pulled into another reality. The camera was a tether that connected his world to the one he saw in the grainy black and white. Barnaby went back to the darkroom and grabbed the camera to see if he could reverse the process by taking another. He stepped back out into the town square and faced the frozen crowd of his friends and his many long neighbors. He saw Marigold Vance, who was a 70-year-old florist, standing near her colorful booth of lilies and red roses. Her hand was outstretched, as if she was about to offer a flower to a small and very excited young girl. Barnaby aimed the camera at the center of the town clock and waited for the second hand to move again. The air was so still that he could hear the sound of his own heart beating against his ribcage. He pressed the button, but this time there was no sound and the shutter did not move at all today. Archived calls from the neighboring town of Eastport mentioned that the entire village of Oakhaven had disappeared in a thick mist. The dispatch logs recorded that the mist was so dense that it blocked out all radio signals and every telephone line. State police reportedly arrived at the edge of the town limits and found only a large and empty forest of pines. There were no roads and no buildings, and the harbor was nothing more than a jagged and very rocky cliffside. Barnaby was the only person left inside the pocket of time that had been created by the mysterious old camera. He spent the next few hours walking through the silent streets and trying to wake the people from their deep sleep. He felt like a ghost who was wandering through a museum of his own life and his many personal memories. He returned to the Historical Society and sat on the floor with the master ledger and the final developed photograph in hand. Barnaby began to write a detailed account of everything that had happened since he found the camera on the park bench. He wanted to leave a record for anyone who might find the town if it ever returned to the normal world. He described the light from the ocean and the way the town square felt like it was trapped inside of glass. He wrote about Thaddeus Thorne and Marigold Vance and the way the festival had been full of such great hope. His hand was shaking, but he continued to fill the pages with the history of a town that no longer. Barnaby realized that his role as an archivist was more important now than it had ever been in his life. As the sun began to set on the frozen day, Barnaby noticed a small change in the light coming from the Rossbin. The violet water was slowly flowing back into the harbor, and the hum from the ground was becoming much louder now. He ran back to the town square and saw that the second hand on the clock was finally starting to tick. The people began to move, and the sound of the brass band suddenly filled the air with a loud and triumphant. Thaddeus Thorne finished his hot dog, and Marigold Vance handed the flower to the young girl who was waiting so. Barnaby looked at the camera in his hand and saw that it was now just a piece of rusted metal. The lens was cracked, and the film was gone, as if it had never existed in the first place. He walked over to the trash can and dropped the broken camera inside before turning to walk back to the society. No one noticed that the world had stopped for hours, and no one remembered the violet water or the glowing plants. Barnaby was the only one who carried the memory of the silence and the sight of the ruined future town. He went back to his desk and looked at the master ledger, which was now filled with his frantic handwriting. He decided to keep the book hidden in the vault so that the people of Oakhaven could live in peace. He knew that some things were better left as secrets that were buried deep within the dusty archives of history. The summer festival continued into the night, and the town was filled with the light of many bright paper lanterns. Barnaby Kroll lived for many more years, and he never spoke a single word about the day that time stood still. He continued to document the lives of the people in the village with a sense of reverence and great care. Every time he saw a camera, he felt a small chill in his heart, but he never took another photo. He understood that a photograph captures a moment, but it can also trap a soul if the light is wrong. The archives remained a quiet place where the past was protected from the many changes of the modern and busy world. Barnaby passed away in 2005, and he left the master ledger to a young woman who shared his. He told her to always watch the harbor and to never trust a camera that was found on a bench. Final footage from a local news crew captured the last moments of the festival before the storm arrived late that evening. The video showed the town of Oakhaven looking perfectly normal and full of life under the dark and cloudy summer. There was no sign of the silence or the ruined town square that Barnaby had seen in the mysterious photograph. The residents still talk about the year 1986 as one of the best summers they had ever experienced. They remember the music and the food and the way the community came together to celebrate their shared history, but in the back of the archive vault, there is a book that tells a very different and terrifying story. It is a record of a few minutes where everything stopped and the world revealed its dark and true face. To this day, the town of Oakhaven remains a peaceful place, but the lighthouse still casts a long shadow over beach. Visitors often say that they feel a strange sense of calmness when they walk through the quiet and narrow village. They do not know that they are walking through a place that once ceased to exist in the normal flow. The mystery of the photograph is a part of the land now, and it will likely stay there forever, and Barnaby Kroll was a man who saw the truth, and he chose to protect his town by staying silent, and silence is a gift that we often take for granted until we are forced to live inside of it alone. The town continues to thrive, and the archives are still there waiting for the next story to be written soon. In this news story, the night guard's final shift was missing from records. Most people believe that digital records are permanent marks of history that can never be truly erased or completely forgotten. However, a security guard named Silas Thorne discovered in the winter of 1992 that records are very fragile. Silas was a 42-year-old man who worked at a remote storage facility on the edge of town. He was a quiet person who preferred the silence of the night shift to the busy energy of the day. The facility was a massive complex of concrete buildings that held everything from old furniture to sensitive corporate paper files. Silas had worked at this location for over 10 years, and he knew every single corner of the dark property. He was planning to retire and move to a small cottage by the lake after his very last scheduled shift. His final night began like any other evening, with the sound of his heavy boots echoing on the gravel lot. He arrived at the main gate at exactly 8 o'clock and waved to the guard who was leaving the post. Silas walked into the small security office and sat down in the creaky wooden chair behind the main control desk. He opened his thermal lunchbox and took a long sip of hot coffee while he stared at the monitors. The facility was covered by 32 different cameras that provided a grainy view of the long and empty hallways. Silas began his first round of the night by grabbing his heavy flashlight and a ring of iron master keys. He walked through Building A and checked the padlocks on every single door to ensure that they were tightly secured. The air inside the warehouse was cold and smelled of dust and the faint scent of old motor oil leaks. Silas enjoyed the routine because it gave him time to think about his future life away from the city lights. He reached the back of the property near the woods when he noticed that the motion light was not working. He stepped closer to the metal fence and saw that the wires had been cut with a very clean stroke. This was the first time in 10 years that Silas had found any sign of a possible security breach here. He pulled his radio from his belt and tried to call the main office, but he heard only heavy static. He decided to return to the security desk to check the camera footage from the last few minutes of video. When he reached the office, he found that the monitors were all showing a flat and flickering gray screen instead. Silas checked the logging computer and realized that the system was no longer recording any data from the perimeter sensors. He tried to type in his override code, but the keyboard did not respond to his frantic and heavy keystrokes. He felt a sudden chill as he realized that the entire security system had been manually disabled from within the building. Silas grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the main server room, which was located in the basement of Building C. He had to walk through a long underground tunnel that connected the different sections of the large and sprawling complex. The lights in the tunnel were flickering, and some of the bulbs had been smashed into small, jagged glass pieces. He reached the heavy steel door of the server room and found that it was standing slightly open and ajar. Silas pushed the door open and shone his light around the room until he saw a small black plastic device. The device was attached to the main data line, and it was blinking with a steady and rhythmic red light. He realized that someone was actively wiping the digital archives and the entry logs in real time as he watched. Silas heard a soft footstep behind him, and he spun around while raising his flashlight to see the dark hallway. There was no one there, but he could hear the sound of a heavy door closing far off in the distance. He ran back to the security office to find his personal logbook, where he kept a manual record of events. When he reached the desk, he saw that his logbook was missing and his thermal coffee cup was tipped over. The coffee was still steaming on the desk, which meant that someone had been in the office seconds before him. Silas felt a surge of panic because he realized that he was being hunted inside the very place he knew. He decided to leave the building and get to his car so he could drive to the nearest police station. He ran through the dark warehouse and reached the main exit, but he found that the door was electronically locked. The manual release lever had been removed, and the emergency exit was blocked by a heavy stack of wooden pallets. Silas was trapped inside the facility, and he knew that the intruder was likely watching his every move on camera. He retreated to a small storage room that contained old cleaning supplies and a single small window near the ceiling. He climbed up on a plastic barrel and tried to see out into the parking lot to find help nearby. He saw a black sedan parked next to his own truck, and two figures were standing near the front gate. They were wearing dark uniforms that looked official, but they did not have any visible badges or identifiable name tags. Silas realized that these men were not regular burglars, and they were clearly looking for something very specific in the files. He remembered that Building B held the records for a large chemical company that had closed down several years ago. Silas decided to find those records before the intruders could destroy the evidence they were trying to hide from everyone. He crawled through the ventilation ducts to avoid being seen by the cameras that might still be partially working now. The dust in the vents made it hard to breathe, but he moved slowly and quietly toward the next building. He reached Building B and dropped down into a small office that was filled with tall metal filing cabinets. Silas began to search through the drawers until he found a folder labeled with the name of a local project. The documents inside described a massive leak that had been covered up by the company in the 1980s and 90s. He realized that this was the reason why the intruders were here, to erase the final traces of the crime. Silas heard the sound of a circular saw cutting through the metal door of the building just a few feet away. He grabbed the folder and looked for another way out before the men could find him in the small office. He found a small freight elevator that was used to move boxes between the different floors of the large warehouse. He jumped into the elevator and pulled the manual cable to descend into the darkness of the lower storage levels. The intruders reached the office just as the elevator disappeared from view, and they began to shout to each other. Silas reached the bottom floor and ran toward the back of the building where the old drainage pipes were located. He knew that one of the pipes led out to a small creek that ran behind the industrial property line. He squeezed his body into the narrow concrete pipe and crawled through the cold and muddy water for several minutes. He finally emerged into the fresh night air and ran as fast as he could toward the thick woods. Silas did not stop until he reached a small gas station that was located 2 miles down the main road. He called the police and waited for them to arrive while he clutched the damp folder to his chest. When the authorities arrived at the storage facility, they found that the gate was open and the office was empty. The black sedan was gone, and there was no sign of any intruders or any damage to the main doors. The lead investigator was a man named Detective Miller, who looked at the security logs on the main office computer. He told Silas that the records showed no activity at the facility for the last 24 hours of time. According to the digital logs, Silas had never signed in for his shift, and the cameras were never active. Even the manual logs in the office were completely blank and showed that no one had been there all night. Silas showed the detective the folder he had taken, but the pages inside were nothing but blank white sheets of paper. He realized that the intruders had switched the folders or used some kind of chemical to erase the black ink. The detective thought that Silas might be suffering from a mental breakdown due to the stress of his upcoming retirement. Silas tried to explain about the cut wires and the red blinking device, but everything had been perfectly repaired already. He looked at the parking lot and saw that his truck was exactly where he had left it that evening. The only thing that was missing was the record of his final shift, which had been completely erased from history. Silas Thorne moved to his cottage by the lake, but he never truly felt safe in the quiet of nature. He spent his days looking over his shoulder and wondering if those men were still watching his every move daily. He kept his own manual logbook now, and he wrote down every detail of his life in permanent blue ink. The case of the missing shift was never solved, and it remained a strange legend among the local police officers. Most people believe that Silas simply imagined the entire event because of the loneliness of the long night shifts there. However, Silas knew the truth because he still had the heavy Iron Master keys in his old jacket pocket now. He had forgotten to return them during the chaos, and they were the only physical proof of his final night. The keys were a constant reminder that some secrets are powerful enough to rewrite the very records we trust most. Silas Thorne lived out the rest of his life in peace, but he never again worked a job at night. He understood that the darkness can hide more than just shadows, and the truth is often written in disappearing ink. The facility was eventually torn down to make way for a new shopping mall in the year 2005. No evidence of the chemical leak or the missing guard logs was ever found in the rubble of the building. The story of the night guard serves as a warning about the hidden layers of the world that we inhabit. We trust the records to tell us what happened, but sometimes those records are just a very carefully crafted lie. Silas Thorne was a witness to a truth that was never meant to be known by a simple security guard. He carried that secret with him until the day he died, and he never spoke of the night again publicly. The records may be missing, but the memory of the cold wind and the red light stayed with him forever. It is a strange thing to realize that you can be erased from the history of your own life's work. Silas Thorne learned that the hard way on a cold night in 1992 at the storage facility gates. He was a man who disappeared from the records, but he never truly lost his own sense of the truth. The world continued to turn, and the story of the final shift became nothing more than a ghost story told. People still talk about the guard who claimed he was hunted by men who did not exist in any file. They laugh and say it was just the imagination of an old man who was ready to leave his job. But Silas knew better, and he kept his keys close to his heart until his very last breath was gone. The ranger who noticed a pattern in the missing 411 cases. The ranger did not notice the pattern all at once. At first, each case felt separate, isolated by geography, weather, and circumstance. Different parks, different years, different victims. On paper, there was no reason to connect them. That was the point. His name was Daniel Mercer, and by the time the realization began forming, he had already spent more than a decade working across multiple national parks. He was not assigned to investigations by choice. Missing persons cases simply became part of the job the longer he stayed. Early in his career, disappearances followed expectations. Hikers slipped, climbers misjudged routes, visitors underestimated distance or heat, search teams found evidence that behaved logically. Even when outcomes were tragic, they made sense. Then came the cases that did not. The first one that stayed with him involved a middle-aged man who vanished on a well-marked trail during clear weather. The trail was wide enough for maintenance vehicles and busy enough that witnesses should have seen something. The man was last spotted less than half a mile from the trailhead. Search teams arrived quickly, dogs locked on to scent immediately and followed it with confidence. Then, without warning, the trail ended in open terrain. No water, no rock face. No sudden change in elevation. The dogs stopped and refused to continue. At the time, Daniel accepted the explanation given. Wind shift, thermal lift, scent pooling. These were standard phrases, repeated often enough to feel convincing. But the image stayed with him. Months later, in a different park, a child disappeared under similar circumstances. A family picnic, a short walk ahead, a momentary distraction. The search unfolded the same way. Strong scent. Sudden stop. No logical exit. Daniel began keeping a private mental list. Not notes, just memories. Over the years, the list grew. Experienced hunters vanished without signs of struggle. Children were found days later, miles away, calm and unable to explain where they had been. Personal items appeared placed rather than dropped. Boots upright, clothing folded. Backpacks resting beside trails. Each time, official explanations fit well enough to close reports, but together, the cases felt wrong. The turning point came during a winter search. A hiker disappeared during stable conditions with light snow and low wind. Search teams found a single line of footprints leading into a clearing. Every other track in the area had been erased by weather. That one remained sharp and untouched. The prints stopped abruptly in the center of the clearing. There was no fall, no slide, no sign the person had turned around, just the final step, frozen in place. Daniel stood there longer than necessary, staring at the snow. Something about it unsettled him in a way training could not smooth over. Snow should erase evidence. Wind should soften edges. Yet, the prints looked recent days later. Later that night, reviewing reports from older cases, Daniel noticed something else. Certain terrain features repeated themselves: boulder fields, dense berry patches, creek systems that vanished underground, areas where sound behaved strangely and distance felt distorted. These were not dangerous places on their own. Thousands of visitors crossed them safely every year, but disappearances clustered near them. Timing repeated too. Late afternoon, early evening, moments of transition when light changed or weather shifted quietly. People vanished when nothing felt urgent. Daniel did not share these thoughts openly. Rangers are trained to avoid speculation. Patterns invite questions. Questions create panic. So he stayed quiet and watched. He noticed how often radios failed in narrow zones during searches, how dogs reacted with confusion rather than fatigue, how recovered individuals described hearing sounds that led them away. None of this went into reports. Over time, Daniel realized the pattern was not about who disappeared, but how. Sudden absence, evidence behaving incorrectly, silence where noise should exist. He did not believe in a single cause. He did not think the parks were hiding something intentionally. He believed there were blind spots, places where human perception, terrain, and environment overlapped in ways that broke expectations, places where a few steps could remove someone from the familiar world faster than logic allowed. The realization did not frighten him. It unsettled him. Because once you see a pattern like that, you cannot unsee it. And Daniel Mercer knew that noticing it meant carrying it alone. Once Daniel noticed the pattern, he began seeing it everywhere, not because it was new, but because he had learned where to look. Each new case arrived with its own details, yet the structure underneath felt familiar, like a story retold with different names. He started paying closer attention during searches, not to outcomes, but to moments when things stopped behaving as expected. Dogs were the first indicator. In ordinary cases, scent weakened gradually. It wandered, broke, then reappeared farther downslope or near water. In these cases, the scent ended cleanly, as if cut. Handlers used the same word again and again: confusion. The dogs were not tired or distracted. They simply could not reconcile what they were smelling. Daniel watched handlers restart tracks multiple times from different points, only to reach the same invisible boundary. Beyond it, the dogs would not go. Technology followed a similar pattern. Radios worked perfectly across most of the park, then failed without warning in narrow pockets. Global positioning devices drifted just enough to matter, pushing coordinates off by small but dangerous margins. Batteries drained faster than expected during long grid searches, even when temperatures were moderate. Once teams moved out of certain areas, everything returned to normal. Official explanations always existed: terrain interference, atmospheric conditions, equipment limitations. Daniel accepted those explanations individually. What unsettled him was repetition tied to disappearances. Sound behaved strangely too. During several searches, Daniel noticed how voices carried incorrectly. Shouts echoed from the wrong direction. Sometimes sound seemed to collapse inward, creating a pocket of quiet that felt unnatural. Searchers would stop listening, convinced they heard movement just beyond sight. Nothing ever emerged. When teams moved again, the sound followed. None of this was dramatic enough to report, none of it violated protocol, but taken together, it changed how Daniel moved through the field. He also noticed something about recoveries. Children found alive after several days often appeared calmer than expected. They were not panicked, they were not disoriented in ways Daniel had been trained to expect. When questioned gently, they struggled to explain where they had been. Some described hiding because it was loud. Others mentioned following voices or sounds they could not describe clearly. Medical professionals attributed this to stress responses or memory disruption. Daniel accepted that explanation publicly. Privately, he noticed how often these children were found uphill, beyond logical travel routes in areas that had already been searched. In fatal cases, the pattern continued. Remains sometimes appeared in places Daniel personally remembered searching. The reports used familiar language: delayed discovery, environmental concealment, animal movement, all reasonable. Still, Daniel remembered where he had stood, where he had looked, and how confident he had been that the area was clear. The pattern was not perfect. Many disappearances were simple accidents. Many searches ended with clear answers. Daniel did not ignore those cases. What troubled him were the outliers. Cases where evidence behaved incorrectly, where time and distance stopped aligning, where experienced people made choices that contradicted every instinct they had developed. Over time, Daniel realized something else. The pattern did not care about experience. Hunters, hikers, children, and seasoned outdoors workers all appeared in the same category once conditions aligned. It was not about skill. It was about location, timing, and perception. Daniel never gave this pattern a name. Naming it would make it real in a way that carried responsibility. He understood why agencies avoided that. If something cannot be defined, it cannot be warned against. So Daniel did what rangers are trained to do. He adjusted quietly. He lingered longer in certain areas. He trusted instincts sooner. He paid attention when the environment felt subtly wrong, even if the weather and terrain looked safe on paper. He also learned to stay silent. Talking openly about patterns invited speculation. Speculation created fear. Fear put more people in danger. But the pattern did not fade. Each new case reinforced it, adding another piece Daniel carried privately. By the time he realized how deeply it had shaped his thinking, the pattern was no longer something he noticed. It was something he expected, and that expectation weighed on him more than any single disappearance ever had. By the later years of his career, Daniel no longer looked at missing cases the way he once had. He still followed procedure, still trusted training, but he no longer expected clarity. Experience had taught him that some searches ended not because effort failed, but because understanding did. The pattern had changed how he listened to the land. He noticed how often disappearances began during moments that felt insignificant. A short pause, a slight separation, a quiet decision to step off a familiar route. There was rarely urgency, no obvious danger, just a small deviation that should not have mattered. And then it did. Daniel began to recognize a certain stillness that preceded the worst searches. Not silence exactly, but a flattening of sound. Wind that moved trees without carrying noise. Spaces where voices seemed swallowed rather than echoed. These moments never appeared on weather reports or maps. They appeared only to those standing inside them. He also became careful with language. With families, he spoke honestly but gently. He explained terrain, weather, and complexity. He avoided promises. He avoided speculation. What he did not say was that sometimes the land refused to return what it took. Among colleagues, Daniel spoke even less. Most rangers sensed the same things, but few wanted to articulate them. Naming the pattern would give it weight. Weight carried responsibility, and responsibility without solutions was dangerous. So they worked harder instead. They extended searches beyond policy. They revisited places that made no sense. They checked areas already cleared. They listened when something felt off, even if they could not explain why. Daniel knew this was not fear. It was respect. He did not believe the parks were hostile. He believed they were indifferent. Vast systems operating on scales that did not align with human expectations. Most days, those systems were harmless. On rare days, they intersected with people in ways that erased them quietly. When Daniel retired, people asked if he believed in a single cause behind the disappearances. He always gave the same answer. No, he believed in blind spots. Places where terrain, weather, and human perception overlapped just enough to break assumptions. Places where a few steps could remove someone from familiar reality faster than logic allowed. He believed the pattern existed not because something hunted people, but because humans overestimated how well they understood the environments they entered. Daniel never published his observations, he never gave them a title, he never turned them into warnings meant to scare people away. He shared them quietly, when asked, with those who understood what it meant to carry unanswered questions without needing to resolve them. The pattern still exists. It does not announce itself. It does not happen often enough to be obvious. It waits in the background, visible only to those who have watched enough searches end without answers. Daniel lives with that knowledge now, far from the parks that shaped him. He hikes less. He listens more. He trusts the moments when something feels wrong, even when nothing appears dangerous. Because once you notice a pattern like that, you stop believing every disappearance is loud. Some are quiet, some leave no trail, and some are only ever noticed by the people who stayed long enough to see them repeat. People who entered these parks were never seen again. Rangers noticed the problem when a name stayed on the board longer than it should have. Search grids had been completed, dogs had worked every trailhead, and weather conditions had cooperated. Yet the name remained written under the word missing, untouched by time or answers. Most disappearances begin with normal movement. A vehicle is logged at a trailhead. A hiker checks in at a station. A family is seen entering a marked path. For a while, everything follows expectation. Then, at some point, the movement stops. In the majority of cases, there is a reason. Injury, exposure, medical trouble, or poor navigation eventually explains what happened. Even when the outcome is tragic, the process makes sense. Evidence appears where it should. Timelines can be rebuilt. The cases that unsettled rangers were different. In these parks, people entered normally. They followed rules, stayed on marked trails, and carried supplies. Some were experienced outdoors, people who knew the terrain well. Others were first-time visitors doing everything right. None of that seemed to matter once the pattern began. Separation was often measured in seconds. Someone walked slightly ahead, someone lagged behind to tie a boot or take a photograph, someone stepped a short distance off trail to use the restroom. Witnesses later insisted the gap was too small for anything serious to happen. When rangers arrived, they expected to reconstruct a clear timeline. Instead, they found gaps. Footprints sometimes led into open terrain and stopped without explanation. Personal items appeared where they should not have been. A backpack rested beside a trail as if placed intentionally. A jacket lay folded on a rock despite incoming weather. There were no signs of panic or struggle. Tracking dogs provided early warnings. In normal searches, scent weakens gradually or breaks near water or rock. In these cases, dogs tracked confidently until they reached a precise point and stopped. Handlers described confusion rather than fatigue. The trail did not fade. It ended. Search teams expanded outward. Helicopters flew grid patterns. Rangers checked drainages, ridgelines, and areas that made little sense. Days passed. Weather shifted. Evidence degraded. Still, nothing appeared. In some cases, nothing was ever found. Vehicles remained parked at trailheads long after storms passed. Campsites sat untouched with food still sealed. Tents stood upright with zippers closed and gear exactly where it had been left. It looked as if the person had stepped away briefly and planned to return moments later. They never did. Rangers documented every step carefully. Reports were written, reviewed, and filed. Official explanations focused on exposure, terrain complexity, or delayed discovery. These explanations were reasonable, but they did not always feel complete to the people who walked the ground. Certain parks began to stand out, not because they were more dangerous, but because similar disappearances repeated within them. Wide trails, stable weather, fast response times. Still no answers. Rangers remembered how normal everything felt at the beginning of each case. They remembered the confidence that the search would succeed. They also remembered the quiet shift when it became clear the land was not giving anything back. The parks themselves showed no sign of violence. No obvious hazards appeared where people vanished. Instead, there was silence, space, distance that swallowed sound and direction. Most days, none of this mattered. Millions of visitors entered these parks and left safely. Trails reopened, signs were replaced, new names filled the logbooks. But on rare days, someone entered and was never seen again. There was no single explanation and no warning map that marked where it might happen next. Only repetition, spread thinly enough to avoid attention, but consistent enough to change how experienced rangers listened to the land. Disappearance in these parks was rarely dramatic. There were no screams, no witnesses, no sudden chaos. There was only a final step forward, a moment of normal movement, and then nothing at all. The trail continued. The forest closed in, the park remained open, and the person who entered was gone. As searches stretched from hours into days, rangers began to notice how consistently these cases resisted normal logic. The terrain did not match the outcome, the conditions did not justify the absence of evidence. And yet, the result was always the same. The person was gone, and the land offered nothing in return. Certain locations appeared again and again across unrelated cases. Boulder fields where sound seemed to collapse inward. Talus slopes that shifted underfoot and absorbed noise. Dense patches of brush where visibility vanished in seconds even under clear skies. Creek systems that disappeared underground and re-emerged far from where anyone expected. None of these places were hidden or forbidden. Visitors crossed them safely every day. What unsettled rangers was how often vanishings clustered near them without warning. Timing became another quiet pattern. Many disappearances occurred during transitions. Late afternoon slipping toward evening, clear weather giving way to sudden fog. Calm mornings interrupted by storms that isolated one person while sparing groups only a short distance away. Rangers described it as the moment when the park changed character without announcing it. During these searches, technology began to behave inconsistently. Radios lost signal only in narrow zones. Global positioning devices drifted just enough to matter. Batteries drained faster than expected. These problems resolved immediately once teams moved away from specific areas. Terrain interference explained some of it. Rangers accepted that explanation. What they could not ignore was repetition. Sound became unreliable as well. Voices echoed from directions that made no sense. Shouts vanished entirely. Searchers reported hearing movement in brush that never produced animals or people. When teams stopped, the sound stopped. When they moved again, it resumed at the same distance. None of this went into official reports. Some of the most unsettling moments came not from loss, but from recovery. In rare cases, missing individuals were found alive days later. These recoveries should have brought relief. Instead, they raised new questions. Survivors were sometimes calmer than expected, with minimal signs of dehydration or exposure. They struggled to explain where they had been. Some repeated phrases that did not align with time passed. Others described hiding from weather that never came, or following sounds they could not describe clearly. Medical explanations focused on stress responses, memory disruption, or the effects of cold. Rangers accepted those explanations publicly. Privately, they noticed how often survivors were found uphill, beyond logical routes, in places already searched. In other cases, remains were discovered long after searches ended. Sometimes they appeared in areas that had already been cleared multiple times. Reports listed delayed discovery. Rangers remembered standing in those exact places earlier, convinced nothing was there. These moments changed how rangers moved through the parks. They doubled back more often. They revisited locations that did not make sense. They listened closely when the environment felt unusually quiet or still. They trusted instincts sooner, even when those instincts could not be explained. Rangers did not talk about these changes openly. Their job required calm authority, public fear, complicated rescues, and placed more people at risk. Silence became part of professionalism. Files continued to close, names were removed from boards, trails reopened, visitors returned. But the pattern remained. Across years and across parks, the same types of cases surfaced again and again. People entered familiar places and vanished without witnesses, without struggle, and without a clear path forward. By the time a ranger had seen enough of these cases, certainty felt fragile. Experience no longer brought confidence so much as caution. Because once you have watched the land refuse to explain itself enough times, you begin to understand that not every disappearance is loud. Some are quiet, efficient, and final. And the park does not always tell you why. By the time rangers reach the later years of their service, they stop expecting clean endings. They still work every case with urgency and discipline, but certainty becomes something they handle carefully rather than trust fully. What stays with them are not the dramatic rescues or the tragic recoveries. It is the unresolved spaces between events. The moments where effort, experience, and technology fail to produce answers. Rangers begin to understand that confidence can be dangerous. Familiar trails encourage assumptions. Repeated success breeds the belief that the land will behave the same way every time. The cases that haunt them are the ones that punish that belief quietly. They think about how often the missing were doing ordinary things, walking established paths, checking maps, following rules that work almost every other day. Nothing reckless, nothing dramatic, just normal movement that ended. Over time, rangers adjust their behavior in subtle ways. They linger longer in places that feel wrong without being obviously dangerous. They pay attention to moments when sound drops or when the environment feels unusually still. They watch how weather changes not just quickly, but selectively. They also become more careful with promises. When families ask how someone could disappear so completely, rangers choose their words with precision. They speak about vast terrain and rapid environmental shifts. They explain how evidence can be missed even by trained teams. They offer honesty without speculation. What they do not say is that sometimes the land does not return what it takes. After retirement, a few rangers finally speak more openly. Not in dramatic declarations, but in long conversations meant to preserve experience rather than provoke fear. They avoid simple explanations in either direction. They do not say every disappearance is mysterious. Most are not. Accidents, exposure, and medical events explain the majority of cases, but not all. They speak instead about limits. Limits of tracking when scent behaves unpredictably. Limits of technology in complex terrain. Limits of human perception under stress. Limits of how quickly people can recognize when conditions are changing in ways that matter. They admit that there are blind spots where these limits overlap. Places where sound bends, where distance deceives, where weather isolates one person while sparing another only a short distance away. Places where a few steps are enough to break every assumption about safety. The parks are not malicious. They are indifferent. They operate on scales of time, geology, and weather that do not align with human expectations. Most days, this difference is harmless. On rare days, it becomes decisive. Rangers continue their work anyway. They train harder, they refine protocols, they push for better communication systems and faster response times. They do everything within their control to reduce risk. Still, when a disappearance follows the familiar pattern, the same quiet realization returns. Some cases cannot be explained fully with what is known now. Admitting that does not mean surrender. It means respect. Respect for uncertainty. Respect for environments that do not bend to human logic. People who entered these parks were never seen again, not because they ignored warnings or courted danger, but because wilderness does not promise fairness. The trails remain open. The forests continue to grow. New visitors arrive every season believing preparation guarantees safety. Rangers know better. Their unspoken message is simple and earned. Stay together. Do not rush decisions. Respect closures. Pay attention when the land feels different, even if you cannot explain why. Because sometimes the wilderness does not take people loudly. Sometimes it takes them quietly, and it leaves behind no reason at all. The missing cases park rangers aren't allowed to talk about. Every ranger learns early that silence is part of the job. Visitors see uniforms, maps, and friendly warnings. What they do not see are the internal briefings, the closed files, and the cases discussed only behind locked doors. Most missing persons incidents are public. They follow procedures, generate press releases, and end with recoveries or clear conclusions. Those cases are allowed to be talked about. They teach lessons. They justify funding. They reassure the public that systems work. Then there are the others. Rangers do not use an official term for them. In internal conversations, they are referred to quietly as restricted cases or administratively sensitive incidents. These are the disappearances where facts do not line up cleanly and where public discussion would raise more questions than answers. A former ranger once described them as cases that do not behave. In these incidents, people vanish without witnesses in places that should not allow it. Trails are wide. Visibility is clear. Weather is stable. Search response is fast. And still, The person is gone. What makes these cases different is not that they are unsolved. Many missing persons cases remain unsolved. What makes them restricted is the nature of what is found during searches. In some files, rangers documented personal belongings placed with unnatural care. Boots aligned side by side, clothing folded neatly despite rain or snow, backpacks left upright without signs of struggle. These details alone do not break rules, but when combined with other factors, they become problematic. Another red flag is location inconsistency. In restricted cases, victims are sometimes found in places already searched multiple times. Rangers log these as delayed discovery, but internally, they question how entire teams, dogs, and aerial searches missed something later found in plain sight. Those questions are not written down. Scent behavior is another reason cases go quiet. In standard searches, dogs track scent until terrain or water disrupts it gradually. In restricted cases, dogs stop abruptly in open ground. Handlers report confusion rather than fatigue. The scent does not weaken, it ends. That detail alone is enough to move a case into limited discussion. Rangers are instructed not to speculate publicly. Official explanations are always environmental: wind shifts, thermal lift, water movement, animal interference. These explanations are often valid and usually sufficient, but not always. Some restricted cases involve children found alive days later. These children are often calm, minimally dehydrated, and unable to explain where they were. They sometimes repeat phrases that do not correspond to time or distance. Medical evaluations attribute this to stress responses or memory gaps. Rangers accept that explanation outwardly. Internally, they note how often the same terrain features appear: boulder fields, talus slopes, sudden elevation changes, dense berry patches, areas where sound behaves strangely and visibility collapses without warning. Another reason these cases are not discussed is ranger experience itself. Rangers involved in restricted cases often report sensations they do not want attached to their names. Feeling watched, sudden disorientation, time distortion during searches, radios failing only in specific zones. None of these belong in reports. A ranger who writes feelings instead of facts does not last long. One retired ranger admitted that during a restricted search, his team heard repeated movement in brush that never produced an animal. The sounds followed their grid pattern. Each time they stopped, it stopped. Each time they moved, it resumed at the same distance. They never documented that. Another ranger spoke privately about a case where a missing hunter was found deceased without any sign of predation, injury, or exposure. The body position suggested he had been placed carefully. The report listed natural causes. The ranger never argued, but he also never forgot. Restricted cases are often sealed or summarized in minimal language. Families receive compassion and effort, but not speculation. Rangers are told that protecting public confidence is part of protecting lives. Panic does not save people. There is also the legal aspect. If an agency acknowledges unexplained patterns, it invites liability. If something cannot be controlled or warned against, it cannot be managed. Silence becomes policy. Rangers talk about these cases only when they retire or leave the service. Even then, many choose not to. They know how quickly stories mutate once released. They know how fast caution turns into myth. The truth they carry is quieter and more uncomfortable. Wilderness is not designed for human understanding. It does not preserve evidence consistently. It reshapes scenes constantly. In rare cases, it creates blind spots where people vanish faster than logic allows. These cases are not supernatural files hidden in vaults. They are ordinary reports with extraordinary absences. They are missing names attached to terrain that refuses to explain itself. Rangers are not forbidden from caring. They are forbidden from speculating publicly. So they follow protocol. They search longer than required. They revisit places that do not make sense. They memorize details they never write down. When asked directly, they give the same answer. All missing persons cases are taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. That statement is true. What they are not allowed to say is that some cases leave them with questions they will never shake. Questions about timing, about placement, about how a person can simply stop being where they should be. The missing cases park rangers are not allowed to talk about are not hidden because they are sensational. They are hidden because no one has figured out how to explain them without admitting that sometimes, even with maps, training, and experience, the land takes someone and does not give a reason back. She called 911 from a snowy highway, then silence. The call began like a lot of winter emergencies. A scared driver on a dark highway where snow erased the world beyond headlights. Dispatch logs later marked it as a stranded motorist report that turned into something much stranger when the line went dead. The woman on that call was named Rena Mallory, 27 years old, who worked stocking shelves at a chain pharmacy. She was driving home after a late shift, taking the same stretch of state highway she used almost every night, a two-lane ribbon running between small towns and empty fields. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Weather reports had warned about a fast-moving band of lake-effect snow, the kind that arrived quietly, then buried everything. Plow crews were staggered across the county, trying to keep the main routes open, but secondary highways always lagged. Rena knew that, yet she also knew missing work meant missing pay she needed badly. Her manager remembered her leaving at closing time, wrapped in a cheap, puffy coat, saying she was going straight home. Store cameras showed her walking across the lot, breath puffing white, boots squeaking on a thin layer of fresh powder. Her compact sedan had a light dusting of snow already crusting the windows. According to her family, Rena called her brother as she pulled onto the highway, chatting on speaker to stay awake. He later told investigators she sounded tired but normal, complaining about a sore back and a customer who argued over coupons. Then the reception crackled. He heard her swear softly about the snow, and the call dropped mid-sentence. The highway that night was a tunnel, lined with banks of plowed snow taller than most cars. Wind pushed loose powder across the blacktop in ghostly sheets, hiding patches of ice underneath. A few trucks still rumbled along, but passenger traffic had thinned. Those who could stay home had already done it. The 911 call came in just after that dropped family call, hitting the county center that served several townships along the route. The dispatcher on duty, a veteran named Carla Reyes, answered with the usual script and heard a woman breathing fast on the other end. The voice identified herself as Rena and gave the highway number in a shaking rush. Carla kept her calm tone, asking Rena to slow down and tell her what was happening. Rena said she had hit something slick, that her car had fishtailed and maybe clipped a guardrail. She thought she was in the median now, or maybe on the shoulder. She could not tell, because the snow was coming sideways and everything outside looked the same. The recording later played in training rooms and small local news packages. You can hear the wind howling through some gap in the car, and underneath that, the thin metallic hiss of tires still turning slowly on packed snow. At one point, Rena says she thinks a truck almost hit her, that its lights came too close, then vanished into white nothing. Carla tried to pin down a location. She asked about landmarks, exits, overhead signs, anything. Rena said she had passed a small green sign maybe 15 minutes earlier, something mentioning a river she did not catch. Her gas gauge had been near half when she left town, and she had not stopped, which helped Carla roughly estimate how far along the highway she might be. While they talked, another voice in the room quietly relayed information to Highway Patrol, starting a unit toward that general stretch. Carla told Rena to stay in the car, to keep her seatbelt on, to turn on hazard lights, and to avoid standing outside in low visibility. Drivers walking around disabled cars in storms get hit too often. Then the call changed. On the recording, Rena pauses mid-sentence, as if straining to listen to something Carla cannot hear yet. She asks if another car is supposed to be there, because she sees headlights in her side mirror that were not there a second ago. Her breathing speeds up, and the phone microphone amplifies the soft rustle of her coat. Carla asks if it might be the trooper already arriving, although she knows that would be too fast. Rena says the vehicle is stopped behind her, very close, closer than feels normal on an empty highway. She says she cannot see a shape clearly through the snow, just a bright halo flaring around her rear window. Carla starts to say that maybe the other driver is also stuck and needs help, but Rena interrupts. Her voice drops, lower and more worried. She says someone is walking up along the driver's side, that she can see a figure in the mirror. shadow against the headlights. She asks if she should roll down the window, if there is some rule about what to say. Carla tells her firmly to keep the doors locked, to speak through a small crack if she feels safe, and to describe the person. On the tape, you can hear a few seconds where Rena fumbles with something. Maybe the switch for the window, maybe the phone shifting in her hand. Then she says a short phrase that became the line quoted most often in later retellings. She says, "They do not look like a trooper, and there is something wrong with their coat." Carla asks what she means. Rena says the coat looks too thin for weather like that, hanging strangely off one shoulder as if it is not closed properly. She also mentions the figure not wearing a hat, dark hair plastered wet across their forehead, face just out of the mirror angle. The footsteps crunch closer. The phone picks up a faint tapping near the glass. Carla starts raising her voice a little, telling Rena to keep describing the person, asking whether she can see their hands. Before Rena answers, another sound cuts through the call. It is a loud, metallic bang, like a hand or object hitting the car door hard. Rena gasps. There is a clatter as if the phone slips, and the audio fills with muffled scrambling. The last thing clearly heard from her is a short, strained sentence, half covered by wind. She says, "Stop. I am on the phone with 911. Then there is another sharp bang and a low murmur that might be another voice, too distorted to parse. After that, the connection drops into empty static and ends. Highway Patrol reached the general stretch within 20 minutes of that call ending, their light bar carving blue and red tunnels in the snow. Using mile markers and Carla's rough mental map, they began sweeping both sides of the highway, checking medians and shoulders for a compact sedan pulled partly off the road. Visibility made it slow work. Headlights could only penetrate a short distance before bouncing back off swirling flakes. They finally found Rena's car near a gentle curve, nose angled toward the median, rear still partly in the slow lane. Hazard lights blinked steadily, amber flashes painting the snow in uneasy rhythm. The driver door was closed. The engine idled weakly, fan cycling on and off, exhaust puffing through a growing mound behind the bumper. No one sat inside. The driver's seatbelt hung loose against the pillar. Rena's phone lay on the passenger seat. Screen dark, tiny spiderweb crack across one corner. The trooper on scene felt a small electric panic when he first shone his light inside and saw no human shape where there should have been one. He called out her name while checking around the car, shining his beam into the median, along the plow bank, and across the opposite lane. Snow near the driver's side showed footprints, multiple overlapping tracks leading from the door toward the rear of the car. Some looked smaller, likely hers, others longer, the tread pattern different. Those prints did what footprints in unsettling stories sometimes do. They trailed away toward the median, turned as if both people had walked a short distance along the barrier, then simply became a churned patch where the wind had filled most details. Beyond that, nothing obvious. No clear line leading off into the fields, no body shape half buried in a drift. Additional units arrived, along with a county search team and a plow used to block off part of the lane. Over the next hours, they expanded the search grid, walking parallel lines with poles, probing under suspect humps, checking every culvert and ditch along that stretch. A thermal camera from a nearby department flew overhead by helicopter when the weather loosened enough, scanning for warm shapes in the cold field. They found nothing. No injured woman hiding behind a barrier, no clear sign of someone having fallen down a bank, no discarded thin coat that might have belonged to the stranger behind the headlights. The only physical objects connected to Rena were her car, her phone, her bag on the back seat, and a crushed packet of breath mints on the floor. In the first days, most people assumed a simple explanation. Perhaps she had panicked after the small collision, gotten disoriented, and wandered away from the road into the field. In winter, that kills quicker than many realize. Bodies sometimes surface in spring thaws, near fence lines or drainage channels, where snow hides them all season. Yet, as weeks passed and snow receded, deputies walked the fields again under gray skies and found nothing. Dogs brought in to retrace scents along the highway gave confusing results. They alerted near the car itself, then followed a short trail across the median toward the opposite shoulder, where the scent seemed to scatter. No strong line led into the open field beyond. Reviewing the audio became a regular ritual for Arlen Keene, the same detective who had worked other winter disappearances. He did not like unsolved things, especially ones where a person's fear was recorded in real time. He listened to the bangs on the door, the scrambled sounds, the muffled second voice. Each time he wondered whether he heard more detail or whether his brain was filling gaps. An audio tech from the state lab ran the tape through filters, isolating frequencies, trying to bring that second voice into focus. The report they produced said a few words might be present, including what sounded like a short command and possibly a name, but the quality was too poor for certainty. Any interpretation risked forcing language onto random noise. Investigators canvassed the few houses near that rural stretch, talking to residents who occasionally heard highway crashes through their bedroom windows. One older man said he had heard sirens that night and gone briefly to his porch, but he had not seen anything except lights moving through the snow curtain. A couple in a small farmhouse reported hearing a loud horn blast just once, then nothing. Carla, the dispatcher, replayed the call in her head outside the tape. She kept focusing on the detail about the coat, the idea that someone was out there in thin clothing on a bitter night. She wondered whether she should have kept Rena talking about details longer, whether asking about age, height, or any distinguishing feature could have given them something more concrete than that haunting phrase. Months later, a trucker dropped a small piece of information that twisted the case slightly. He called the tip line after seeing a news piece about Rena and said that on that same night he had been driving the highway in question. He remembered passing a small car half off the lane, hazard lights going, and another vehicle pulled up behind it. He could not say the exact mile marker, but he thought it was near the same curve. In his memory, the rear vehicle looked like an older sedan, with one headlight dimmer than the other. Snow blurred the details. He had assumed it was a trooper or Good Samaritan helping, and the conditions were bad enough he did not want to brake hard, so he kept going. When shown photos, he could not confirm any make or model. Still, his description of the staggered headlights matched no marked patrol car in the area. Highway units that night all had functioning light bars and symmetrical headlights. None reported parking behind Rena's car before the initial trooper arrived. Whatever vehicle had been there when the trucker passed left no obvious trace when authorities got to the scene. Later, a freelance producer named Eliza Crane picked up the story for her series about strange emergency calls. She was drawn less to any hint of the supernatural and more to the way real danger and pure uncertainty braided together in winter cases. She interviewed Carla, who still worked nights at dispatch, and Arlen, who kept the case file within arm's reach on his crowded shelf. Eliza pulled weather radar archives from that night, overlaying the band of heaviest snow with the timeline of the calls. The worst visibility hit right around the window between Rena's call to her brother and the arrival of the first trooper. On her podcast, she described it as a perfect storm of timing where someone could approach a stranded car under cover of swirling white and leave again before law enforcement could safely drive full speed. She also dug into reports of people walking the highway in storms. Patrol logs showed occasional contacts with hitchhikers, drivers whose cars had died, and once a confused older woman wandering after a minor crash. On 2 different nights within that same winter, troopers had responded to reports of a person in a thin coat walking along the shoulder miles from town. But in both instances, the person vanished before units arrived, leaving only faint tracks blown over. Whether those were unrelated incidents or part of a pattern, no one could say. People living on the fringe sometimes walk dangerous roads because they have no other option. A thin coat on a freezing highway might indicate poverty, mental illness, or simple bad planning, not mystery. One theory that Eliza highlighted came from a retired trooper who had worked that district years earlier. He believed Rena might have been the victim of an opportunistic crime, someone who used storms to approach stranded drivers under a friendly guise. He pointed to separate cases where robbers targeted cars at rural gas stations during outages, counting on chaos to cover their movements. In his version, the stranger in the wrong coat knocks, offers help, maybe claims to have a nearby house, then pressures the scared driver into leaving the car. Once they are on foot in the whiteout, away from the safety of hazard lights and recorded calls, anything can happen. A struggle just beyond the plowbank could go unheard. A forced march towards some unseen vehicle off an access road could leave only scattered tracks. The more ordinary possibility is simpler and no less tragic. Rena might have panicked when the stranger banged on the door, then decided on her own to leave the car, thinking she could walk to a visible light or structure. The second set of prints could belong to that same stranger, trying to help or simply passing by. Somewhere in that churned patch near the median, the combination of fear, cold, and confusion might have pulled her off in a direction searchers did not later cover thoroughly. Without a body, without a confession, without clear video, no single explanation satisfies everyone. Families tend to cling to the version that offers the most sense, not necessarily the most comfort. For Rena's parents, the idea of a random predator is unbearable. Yet so is the thought of their careful daughter walking away alone into the kind of storm she had grown up respecting. The call itself remains the center of the story. A young woman in a car surrounded by snow, trusting a calm voice in a warm building miles away. A stranger's headlights appearing suddenly in her mirror, footsteps crunching closer, a complaint about a coat that did not make sense for the conditions, then two sharp bangs and empty air. In the years since, dispatcher training in that county uses Rena's case as a reminder that even clear instructions cannot control what happens outside the line. They emphasize keeping callers on as long as possible, probing for small details, coaxing out bits of description that might matter later. They teach new hires to carry these voices carefully, knowing some will never get closure. The highway still runs through those fields, now with slightly taller guardrails and brighter reflective markers along the curve. On winter nights, plow drivers sometimes glance at the spot where Rena's car once sat, watching their own headlight beams bounce off the high snowbanks. Every so often, someone leaving a flower or small cross appears in the frozen ditch, a quiet marker drivers notice only in warmer months. Officially, the file remains open, classified as a missing person case with suspicious circumstances. Off the books. Among the people who heard her last words live or replayed them in dark rooms afterward, it sits in a different category. It is the story they think about when storms roll in and phones ring with scared voices describing spinning headlights and vanishing lines on the road. She called 911 from a snowy highway, her words cutting through static and wind for a brief, fragile span. Then there was silence, a running engine, two sets of footprints fading into a churned patch of snow, and questions that still hang over that curve whenever winter returns.